Perfect. Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fred Haynes with the CPUC's Safety Policy Division. I'll be the coordinator for the workshop today, and I'm the first person on the agenda. So I'd like to again welcome you all, and I want to welcome our colleagues at the Office of Energy Safety who are conducting the workshop jointly with us today. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, yes, we're at the welcome and agenda review. So I do welcome everyone to today's workshop. I'll proceed to an agenda review and go over a few housekeeping items. If we can go to the next slide, please. So just a few ground rules. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, that attendees' mics will be muted unless they request to be called on. So the host will unmute you then in order. We'd like you to hold questions until the actual Q&A sessions, which are at the ends of the various presentations or panels, unless the moderator or host actually invites questions at a different time. We will keep a list of outstanding questions that are received during the workshop. We will try to stick to the timing of the agenda because there's a lot of ground to cover and we don't want to run over in an area that would mean we miss out on something else that's scheduled. And we, as you know, we're recording this, so we will have a link available within a few days that will notify all the attendees what that link will be to a YouTube type video of our workshop. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is fairly redundant, but it seems to be a boilerplate component of all of our webinars. You probably already know how to call in or link in. If you don't otherwise receive copies of the presentations, you can email us a request at the mailbox sb884@cpuc.california.gov. Next slide, please. And we're just giving you a little bit of instruction if you're not familiar with how to operate a WebEx session. There's a raise hand icon. It appears at the bottom of my screen. I think you probably find it the same place on all of your screens. So when you do want to ask a question or make a comment, please hit the raise hand icon and the meeting hosts and moderators will be aware that you've raised your hand and we'll call on you as we can. Okay, so we have some questions coming in. Apparently there's a few panelists that need to be elevated. I've got a request from Thomas Long. So IT, if you can help us change the status for Tom Long and make him a panelist. And that may also apply to Katie Morsoni. So if you can give both of them panelist status, I'd appreciate it. I see Katie is now a panelist.
I'm on. Yeah, I'm good.
Very good. Thanks, Katie. Anyone else in the attendee list that was supposed to be a panelist, please let us know. You'll have to do that in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll respond to you. Thanks. I see Tom is now a panelist. Good afternoon, Tom. Okay. We were just covering the notion of raising hands, so hopefully that's clear to everyone. I will now move on to the next slide. So we actually have our agenda. This is the same agenda that was distributed out yesterday afternoon. and it's just some slight changes were made from the original agenda, mostly just in the names of the people that will be doing some of the activities. I myself will be acting as moderator for panel 1, and I think we put some more names in where we had some placeholders, but that's basically the only change to the agenda. So then just to go through it, after I finish here, I'm going to turn it over to Forrest Kaiser and Julie Alvis, who are senior executives from each of our organizations, the CPUC and the Energy Safety Agency. And they'd like to have a few words at the beginning, and then we'll open it up for a presentation from Ben Lance, who is an industry subject matter expert, and he will talk to us about overall some trends with undergrounding that are happening nationwide, followed by Safety Policy Division's Eric Wu will just go over what SB 884 requirements are. Many of us are already familiar with that, but we thought that would help be a good way of introducing us into the discussion later on. I'll follow that with the first panel-led discussion on the broad topic of regulatory and approval process, questions and issues. We'll have a break so people can have a rest, and then Julie Alvis from Energy Safety will lead the second panel discussion, and I will wrap up at the end of the day. So there's no questions about that agenda overview. I'd like to introduce Forrest Kaiser, Deputy Executive Director of the CPUC. Next slide.
Great, thank you so much, Fred. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being with us here today on a Friday afternoon. My name is Forrest Kaiser, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for Safety and Enforcement and Safety Policy here at the California Public Utilities Commission. Before we dive in, I just wanted to offer a couple of words about why we're here, what we hope to get out of today's workshop, and what happens next. Today's workshop is a scoping exercise. Staff from both agencies have reviewed the legislation and have developed a number of questions about how to proceed with implementation. We've invited experts and stakeholders to join us to provide background and explore these questions and potentially raise some new questions as well. We are counting on you as participants in the workshop to engage with us and make sure that we are thinking about all the things we should be thinking about as we develop our implementation plans. We hope to come out of today's workshop with a fuller and more widely shared understanding of what stakeholders believe each agency's respective implementation plans should address. After this workshop, and before launching the program itself, each agency will need to flesh out proposed implementation plans. We will be coordinating closely together between our agencies, but each agency will have to determine for itself what internal process to use to complete and finalize its own plan. For the CPUC, this could take the form of opening a rulemaking. I will note that some people have noticed in the title to this workshop, it said pre-rulemaking. And just as an aside, I wanted to highlight that that was intended to convey that this workshop is not currently associated with a proceeding, but it wasn't meant to imply that one was necessarily imminent. That's something that we're interested in your feedback on. So regardless of the procedural pathway, it does seem likely at this point that additional workshops will be necessary and helpful to shape the development of the implementation plans. So if there are questions, concerns, or issues that you feel we do not address in sufficient depth today, there will be additional opportunities in the future for you to provide input. So I'll close by noting the significance of this effort. SB 884 requires us to set up a program for reviewing a decade's worth of planned infrastructure investment. In California, 10 years of investment in the energy infrastructure space is a very long time. 10 years ago, there was something like 2.5 gigawatts of solar PV on California's grid. Today, there's well over 30. Over the next 10 years or so, the state will need on the order of another 50 gigawatts of additional clean generation resources to meet new loads, including electrical vehicles and buildings, and be on track to decarbonize our economy at large. In the meantime, catastrophic wildfires will remain an ever-present risk, and we are very conscious of the need to address that risk cost efficiently and using funding sources that spread beyond ratepayers. We need to make sure we are implementing SB 884 in a way that reflects these high stakes. The theme of reducing risk cost efficiently in light of California's major decarbonization investment is one that I'm hoping we will discuss extensively today. I'm looking forward to your creativity and your thoughtful input. And with that, I'll turn it to my colleague, Julie Alvis at the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Forrest. My name is Julie Alvis. I'm the Acting Deputy Director for the Electrical Infrastructure Directorate at the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. Energy Safety is pleased to be able to co-host this informal workshop today, and I look forward to hearing today's discussion. As we prepare to implement Senate Bill 884, we appreciate this opportunity to hear from you all to gain a mutual understanding of the legislation. Energy Safety will approach its responsibilities through the lens of our office's mission, which is to advance efforts that result in long-term utility wildfire safety. I want to thank my colleagues at CPUC, to the stakeholders who are with us as panelists today, and to all of you who are joining us virtually through this WebEx webinar. I hope for a fruitful dialogue today. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Forrest and Julie. I think we can move to our next agenda item. So I'd like to introduce Ben Lands, speaking for the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative. I provided a full bio for Ben, which was distributed with the other panelists' bios yesterday. Ben may want to make a few introductions of himself before he gets started on his presentation. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Fred.
Oh, let's see.
Just look.
There we go.
Okay. So thanks for the introduction, Fred, and it's great to be here with you and with the other panelists, as well as I was looking through the names and I see many folks who I have worked with and interfaced with over the years, many folks that have expertise in many areas. So I think it should be a great discussion today. And really that's the point here. With Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative, our goal is to disseminate information and disseminate information on experience and also get the discussion going so that we can have conversations about smart infrastructure. Next slide, please. A little bit about our organization. We were founded a number of years ago, primarily by some folks in the industry who continually saw that decisions about infrastructure investment were being made in silos, that although utilities tend to be good at sharing information, many myths and points of confusion were around, and we saw continually that less than optimal investments were being made. So with that, we banded together. You can see a number of folks here. We don't have our utility advisors listed here, but we do have utility advisors. And again, our goal is to help the industry evaluate overhead and underground power infrastructure investments, really taking into consider the life cycle cost as opposed to just upfront cost, and hopefully disseminate that information to stakeholders. Next slide, please. So this is about national undergrounding trends. However, I was also asked to touch on overhead as it relates to the conversation we're having here. And so this is not exhaustive, but it is intended to provide some background information, again, to get the conversation going. So looking at underground versus overhead systems, typically the initial cost is lower. let's see, slide 3, please. Yes, thank you. It's easier to inspect. You have a higher capacity to distribute power over longer distances. It does require a larger right-of-way, but it's typically quicker to upgrade from a standpoint of ampacity, or for example, if we're installing covered conductor or tree wire, we can implement that much quicker. Underground, obviously, the upfront cost is considerably higher in many cases. However, in a protected installation, the service life can be longer than overhead. In fact, 2 to 3 times longer, say, for example, compared to, say, wood pole installations. It is, in many applications, more reliable and safer. The maintenance cost is lower, and it tends to be a better usage of the value of the real estate involved. Finally, the technologies can provide detailed inspections, which were not previously possible before. And we'll talk a little bit about that further on. Next slide, please. So this presentation is actually part of a much larger presentation. And I have shortened it here just to a couple bullet points, but each of these points are followed by references. If you need them, I'd be glad to supply them. So electrification, clearly there's a need for not only higher ampacity for, say, charging vehicles and such, or moving from gas appliances to electric appliances, but also there's a need for higher reliability. When we need to be able to charge our cars, or we need to depend on it to the electricity to do our work, to do our job, obviously the reliability is much more important to us. There's also a number of utilities that are taking measurements in resiliency, total time of restoration, or all-in SAIDI, meaning including the impact of storms, whereas previously it's more been an average measurement. And we start using these measurements and we consider the resiliency of our systems, the equation can be much different. So when comparing overhead versus underground options, we think about resiliency. The underground actually has a significant advantage due to its resiliency under storm conditions, or, as we've already been mentioned, fire conditions. We're seeing a number of states looking at the impact of GDP and tax revenue impact. In fact, some actually have one in particular has a legislative rider that's driving some of their infrastructure improvements. So it's seen as more of a societal impact as opposed to just a utility impact. We're also seeing trends where people are moving to areas that are more vulnerable. So, for example, the coasts, about 30% of our population lives within the first county of all of our coasts. When we're seeing the drive for people to live in wildlife and wild to urban interfaces, not only after scenarios where people have to move away, we're seeing people move back in at record rates. So people want to live in these areas, which traditionally may have been floodplains or storm areas, places where there may have been significant weather impacts before, but now we have more people living there. The storms themselves are becoming more costly. Just last year, there were 20 billion-dollar plus storms recorded by the NOAA website. We have vegetation cost management. We have a number of utilities that are seeing a tree die off because of, for example, the emerald ash borer. And so it's not just a limb here or there that's falling down in a storm, it's the whole tree that's coming down. And where the trimming right away used to be a certain distance, well, if a whole tree comes down, that's even well out of the right of way. So it's we see utilities rethinking the vegetation management strategy and the subsequent costs of that from a life cycle management standpoint. We also have better data, so we have a lot more line sensing. So we are able to identify the root cause of failures. And when we have a better root cause of a failure, an RCA, we can come up with better solutions. We can identify how we can mitigate those challenges. For example, we know that there's an EEI report out that shows that the difference between overhead and underground is about a 10x performance in general, just not stating any particular age of asset, but just overall about a 10x difference in performance. And we also have this scenario where we have much better materials and newer technologies available to us that enable longer life and more resiliency. And that gives us opportunities to make investments that can, even though they may be more costly up front, the life cycle costs, when considering the life cycle costs, we can see a great return on investment. Next slide, please. So specifically about underground, again, this presentation is primarily focused on underground, but I will be touching on some overhead solutions as well, where they are, where some of the applications are related. So why underground? When we think about a life cycle analysis, and we're including that life cycle analysis in our measurements, again, we see about a 10 times reliability and resiliency improvement. We see utilities looking at this, the undergrounding, as a capital investment with a consistent rate of return, which is also favored by, again, from investor-owned utility standpoint, by Wall Street. We see regulators, in their own words, stating that they prefer to be able to predict a steady rate of increase as opposed to being surprised by weather disasters and having these spikes of cost and outages. So the idea, for example, that's been proposed here is, and I'm not an expert in this area, but as I understand it, that California is being quite progressive and thinking about investing over a decade period. And this, from my standpoint, is a very exciting opportunity for the industry to think about life cycle analysis and life cycle investment. So again, with undergrounding, the minimal investment in vegetation management over the life of the asset, which can be extensively longer than previous generations of technology. The opportunity to reduce operating and maintenance costs by 10x. So can you imagine if you have 10 times less truck rolls, 10 times less, well, truck emissions, and that also rolls into the safety aspect. If you have assets that are withstanding the storms or even the reliability, they have fewer outages, where most of the safety instances, the cases where there are severe impacts to someone's health that they can no longer work or they have fatalities, those are predominantly related to driving to site and being on site. So if we can eliminate that, obviously safety can improve. And that's not just for the operating and maintenance, that's also for the vegetation management and any other activities it takes to implement and maintain grid systems. Technology improvement, again, the longer life and the ability to assess the quality of underground installations, the ability to have materials that are easier to install at longer lengths and with less cost. Also the construction, we'll get into a couple of those in a little more detail. And finally, the gross domestic product point of view, the tax revenue protecting that has come to the ears of legislatures. And when we think about undergrounding as more of a societal benefit, it no longer becomes a single utility investment. Now it has a broader reach, and there is one utility which we'll mention that has had some legislative relief as opposed to just the typical rate and the rate and proposal opportunities. And just as a quote here, there's been a recent study by Public Utilities Fortnightly, and they went around talking to about a dozen utilities that have participated in one form or another of infrastructure improvement. And when they interviewed Burns and McDonnell, Frank Morrissey in particular, he said that almost every utility that they're talking to is doing some type of strategic undergrounding. So figuring out where the underground makes sense. And obviously it doesn't make sense everywhere, but we're definitely seeing a trend where every utility seems to be looking at it at some level. And obviously the challenges and the needs are different. And at least from a power delivery intelligence initiative, our organization, we're agnostic as it relates to the technologies. We just want to promote a life cycle analysis as opposed to a single upfront cost. Next slide, please. So some of the technologies that we're watching, of course, there's pole technology, different designs of not just wood poles, but you got the fiberglass poles and the concrete poles. And there's far more in the area of poles that I'm not an expert in, but there are folks that are far more knowledgeable about this within the organization, that if anyone would have questions actually about any of these points, that's one of the things that we feel that we bring to the industry is a group of experts in many different areas that can help identify the technology and the opportunities, not only the trends here. So obviously the covered conductor and the automation in the overhead space to minimize the impact of outages and contact of vegetation and protect against ignitions and so forth. One of the interesting areas of underground is the fact that with the new materials, there is technical papers and information showing that these assets can last well over 100 years, provided they're protected, even in submerged and directly buried applications. So a lot of the old rules of thumb, or even the myths that were there about just a 30-year life or 40-year life, really don't hold when we implement assets, underground assets in particular, if we're installing them correctly and we're protecting them against extreme operating conditions. We have factory built and tested accessories with comparable field quality control tests. So we can actually compare with the quality control tests in the factory and make sure that assets are being installed correctly from day one. We've got directional boring and rock saw technologies that are coming to bear that didn't exist even a decade or two ago. And one of my favorite interesting technologies coming along that's being piloted is using plasma torches to not only do tunneling, but trenching. This is very new, but a pretty interesting technology as it relates to areas that ordinarily would be very difficult to excavate. We have precise underground mapping and the connectivity of 3D CAD and augmented reality, such as the lower right-hand corner picture there, where this was one utility using augmented reality to show transformer placement, pad mount transformer placement, so they could literally walk into someone's kitchen and say, this is what it's going to look like in your front yard, and to get buy-in, because customer buy-in is obviously a big part of any infrastructure investment. Ultimately, the ratepayer is paying for it, and if it's going to be in their front yard, getting them engaged, obviously, is to everyone's advantage. The power systems, primarily as it relates to transmission, we have DC systems. DC systems are able to power deliver power over greater distances, more power over greater distances, and also precast concrete modules, being able to plug and play, even if someone would need a duct bank system to be able to install almost like Lego blocks that have installed conduit inside. So some really creative ideas that are out there in these areas that are lowering the cost and extending the life. Longer pulling lengths. You know, there's utilities that are still looking at what's typical for, say, downtown applications, 300 to 400-foot poles. The reality is that with modern technology, you can pull a couple thousand feet with the new fluids for to reduce tensions and the new techniques of modeling pulling distances. And there's more conduit choices that give you different capabilities. You also have technologies like line sensing, which can identify. One of the concerns about, say, undergrounding is that you won't be able to find the fault fast enough. And being able to triangulate where that is, line sensing can help detect those faults and extreme operating conditions, which can damage assets. So that just enables the extension of life. And also, as of late, there's numerous artificial intelligence approaches to asset management. So combining not only condition assessment, but extreme operating conditions to give ultimately a more detailed view and be able to extend the life of distribution and transmission assets. Next slide, please. So some of the large undergrounding programs, some of the folks on the call here are represented here, and I don't intend to miss anyone. This just happens to be some of the largest. And I'll name a couple specifically from around the country and give you a little bit more detail on what they're doing. Next slide, please. So WCE Energy Group, they have a strategic undergrounding program as well as an overhead automation program. They did a survey every year. It's an 8-year program. They've been at it a number of years now. But they did a survey every year, and they found that the vast majority of their customers were willing to pay for more underground. And this is a survey that goes across all of their customers, not just the ones that are being impacted by the upgrades. And this increase actually ends up being $4.30 a month or 5% increase on their bill. And they are seeing dramatic resiliency improvements already. They are seeing a 2% CMI with the automation upgrades they've made. And overall, they're seeing a 97% reduction in CMI, so they're really seeing the difference. And they committed to their Public Utility Commission that this is a 60-year life asset, this undergrounding. So it's not just the theoretical papers that are saying that these assets can live a lot longer. Utilities are recognizing the technology, the capability. They're finding ways to lower the cost through construction and other measures, and they're implementing it at scale. And this is a very exciting thing for us to learn from. Next slide, please. Another utility, Dominion Energy, they have this strategic undergrounding program. In this case, they were able to get a legislative rider supporting the cost of this. So this was a different approach. As far as I know, it's unique, but it's something we want to make sure people know about. So I wouldn't call it a trend, but it's something that I think it reflects that this is a societal benefit, not just a utility customer benefit. That everyone is seeing the benefit of these investments. And they committed to reducing their restoration time, or the total line restoration. This is actually a metric they're using, TLR. Instead of SAIDI, they actually have this measurement, TLR. And their goal is a 50% reduction in the areas that are undergrounded. And so far, they've actually seen Obviously, storms don't hit the same way every time, but they're well on their way to achieving that goal. And this is about a 4,000 mile strategic undergrounding program to the tune of about $2 billion. Next slide, please. Florida Power and Light, they have a hardening program that they have been implementing for a number of years already, and that's been on their feeder system, and that's been primarily concrete poles. And with the most recent hurricane, they've been able to actually test out those poles, and that's what their concern is high winds. And they knew that the root cause of those failures were some of the poles that they had on their feeder system. So they've had a significant program to upgrade those poles on the distribution system. And now that is, I wouldn't necessarily say totally complete, but that program is winding down. They're starting to wind up an undergrounding program for their underground residential distribution. That's mostly backlot. So they have a lot of vegetation issues with those lines, not just accessing them to keep the vegetation down, but also to maintain that reliability during storms. So they have decided to underground, to the best of my understanding anyway, the 27,000 miles they're looking at would be the remainder of the underground residential district, or the residential distribution that needs to be undergrounded. So they originally said something on the order of a 20-year program. They have now shortened that to 10 years. And the latest figures they gave was about a $20 billion program. And this is based on not only the most recent data from the hurricane that hit the west coast of Florida, but also this pilot that I have listed here. They're able to show that on their distribution feeders, which again are overhead and have been hardened, they're able to see a 16% reduction from the impact of Irma on hardened versus non-hardened. Where they're able to underground their distribution laterals, as they call them, the residential distribution, they saw an 83% reduction. So obviously, there's a difference in upfront costs, but there's also a difference in the impact from a resiliency standpoint. And the life cycle analysis is also something that they're looking at. And if you look at their state GDP, which doesn't encompass all of Florida Power and Light's territory, I think they're closer to around an impact of potentially up to a $1 billion GDP. But the total state is $2.3 billion per day. So an impact to the state from a business standpoint and tax revenue is dramatic. And it doesn't take a number of storms to start adding up that cost. So again, back to that societal benefit point of view of these grid investments. Next slide, please. So really, I just want to summarize here. So why national trends in undergrounding? Well, the drivers we see is one of them is electrification. We're needing to upgrade our lines. I think Burns and Mac just had a presentation saying that based on their analysis, about 10% of feeder systems will be able to support the oncoming electrification needs as prescribed by some of the folks who have the vision. So huge opportunity to upgrade to meet our electrification needs. The opportunity to support our customers who are in locations that are at higher risk of outages. And that includes not only the safety of our line workers, the fewer times they need to go out, the better, especially in emergency situations, but also obviously the safety of our customers, the individuals, the rate payers, and the folks that are potentially in harm's way. Whether that be for a downed line. And I take this was actually, I was just driving to my home office this afternoon. And we had a slight windstorm, and wouldn't you know, on my street, there is a pole that was knocked over, and there are emergency personnel keeping people away from it. So So it is an opportunity, if we're going to make the investment, to start eliminate some of these risks. So as I said, customers are choosing to live in high-risk areas, but they want safer, more resilient grid. And with some utilities, we're seeing even by poll, they are willing to pay for it. Not just the people who live in the areas at risk and that are being undergrounded, but as a whole. We see regulatory bodies support the equitable investment because it's not based on any particular area or group. It is focused on where the grid is being hit the hardest, and there's data to back that up. So they also see the impact from a GDP standpoint, the total line restoration, as opposed to just average SAIDI numbers. And also the opportunity to have stable rate increases as opposed to spikes when it comes to weather events. Utility executives in Wall Street, they want the opportunity to invest large dollars with a guaranteed rate of return. So in that, we see that many folks at the C-suite level are saying that this is a win-win, and a triple win for society, a win for the utility, and a win for their investors. And that opportunity to use capital today to eliminate future O&M is a huge and attractive, because many utilities have a 10-to-1, 5-to-1 ratio between their capital and O&M investments from a impact to their P&L and stock price. The technology and scale are driving the costs down. Everywhere we look, we see people being innovative and creating opportunities of scale, just like we heard Robert Gaddis at the Distributech panel session, and I see Jamie Martin's on here as well. She was part of that. WC Energy and Dominion all were part of that panel session. It was a great session down in San Diego. We heard a lot of great technical and also extensive expertise from all of those panelists at that session. But just about how people are driving those costs down and enabling the industry to move forward, especially in the area of undergrounding, which traditionally has been shied away from. And now we see more people using it as a strategic tool. So again, the materials, the manufacturing, the factory comparable ability to have a quality control from the factory all the way to the field is a powerful tool to make sure that these assets are being installed right. Because we're seeing that many of the faults that are happening on these systems are caused because of initial installation issues. So being able to eliminate that up front and making assets easier to install correctly with the modern technologies that are being used from say joints and terminations and so forth. And we're able to see that the cable itself can last 2 to 3 times longer than say the wood pole assets traditionally have been able to. So again, from a life cycle standpoint, we see the trend is that when we look at the total cost of ownership of underground versus overhead assets, we're seeing that underground in more areas than traditionally have been looked at. Now, more than ever, folks are looking at underground as a solution. Again, a strategic solution where the technology makes sense. And with that, I just would like to let you know that there's more information at pdi2.org. And if you have any further questions on any of the statements I've made, there are magazine articles, there are websites and references for all of this data. And if you want to use it as part of your life cycle analysis, I'd be happy to share anything we have, because that's what our organization is all about.
Well, hey, Ben, thank you very much. Very, very interesting information. And we do have a little time on the agenda. I would invite anyone that would like to ask some questions now. We have time until 2 o'clock available. The panelists are all able to unmute themselves. I see Will Abrams is raising his hand. Maybe my IT people can help me see if there are also attendees that are raising their hands to ask questions. Do a quick look through here.
Hi, Fred. This is Jacob from IT. There are no attendees raising their hands.
Okay, thanks. And I just saw that too. I did see a hand from Will and also Eric Wu. Let's start with Will Abrams. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the presentation. Really informative and I think really helpful for all these discussions. Wanted to understand, I think you outlined a number of different advantages for undergrounding and a lot of the different technologies that are being developed.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that you might be able to talk to which of these technologies should we be keeping in mind as we underground. So part of what we understand is that when we underground a line, while it has many advantages, there's somewhat some less flexibility in terms of adopting to new technology or rerouting a line or things like that. And so just wanted to understand what technology should we be aware of so that if 5 years, 10 years down the road that we're sort of accounting for some of the most likely technological innovations as we proceed.
That's a challenging question, and I don't know if I have a precise answer for you, but I can give you a couple of thoughts. One of the things that may come as a surprise, it may be some of the dumb tech, if you might say, but it is technology compared to, say, our grandfather's grid. I mentioned earlier, just with cable itself, cable can be indirectly buried. And in fact, we have studies showing that it's just as reliable as it is conduit. So in some cases, you may decide that the thought process may be, well, we'll install it in conduit because then we can slip it out and upgrade it. And that certainly is the case. We'll install it in conduits in case it fails. Well, you may actually want to think about how do we make sure that it's installed correctly so it doesn't fail. There's number one, right? Aside from, say, dig-ins. Or you may also want to think about, okay, if you're going to have to open a trench anyway, throw an additional conduit in there. One of the utilities that I mentioned here directly buries all their work, but they're also pulling in a spare conduit. If they need to, they can pull a new cable in that's upsized. So you're not spending the time actually pulling in a cable. You're able to directly bury it, get the same performance. And if something does go wrong, you have an option. So that's just one example of simple tech, but somewhere you have an economy of scale. I would also say that as well, that some of the utilities initially decided, well, we're going to just underground this line here, and then we'll come over here and we'll underground that line there. When you think about the economy of scale, being able to say, okay, we have this neighborhood, this area that we're going to underground, that's when you can really get the economies of scale. So that's really not super high tech, but it's something you might want to think about when you're, because a lot of times it's that mobilization, demobilization, start, stop, as opposed to handing, say, for example, an EPC or contractor, a block of work that they can go through and get done. So say if we were in an inner city scenario and you had loads that you're going to be picking up every few hundred feet, that's a scenario where it may make sense to have junction boxes or vaults very frequently that you can have access points. But if you're in a more rural area, I was talking to one utility that was struggling with this idea of infrastructure investment, and what they found is that their designers we're taking the overhead lines and putting just as many, say, protection devices on it as if they would overhead. Well, the reality is you're not going to have so many momentary contacts and so forth with an underground line. So putting all that protection in that application doesn't really make any sense. And so if you're just doing a one-to-one, you want to make sure that your designs are taking the advantage of the fact that you don't need the same design with an underground system. And then also when you're talking about inner city versus rural, you want to think about, you don't want a one size fits all. So I hope that gives a couple of ideas of what to think about. But I would say just one more as it relates to URD, underground residential distribution. Most of that is 200 amp design cable systems. Maybe the transformers wouldn't be able to handle the extensive, the higher ampacity needs from, say, electrification, but the cable itself has a long way to go because many underground residential systems are not being used to that extent right now. That's just a few amps on them. They're mostly designed for voltage drop. So I would encourage folks to reach out to some of these utilities. They're passionate about what they're doing, and they have a lot of lessons learned and willing to talk to others.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I have a few more people that have joined now. Next in line would be Eric from the CPUC, Eric Wu.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for the very informative presentation. So one of your slides, you talk about that the residents who are in the remote area with higher wildfire risk are willing to pay more for their rate. So I just wonder, the study, does that provide a percentage of how much they are willing to pay? Would that be in the lower percentage, or when the cost could increase dramatically, that such as that over 50% more, are they still willing to pay for it? Because we know that some of this undergrounding with the very low density populations area could become very expensive. So what was the study about, and can you elaborate on this piece a little bit more?
Sure. So you might be connecting two pieces. So I want to highlight the study that talked about the customer's willingness to pay. And that was WCEC Energy Group. They're in Wisconsin. So their focus wasn't wildfires. So to be clear, that study, and Paul Gauguin was part of the panel down at Distributech just a week or so ago. And he, and it's also in one of his articles in I believe, Transmission and Distribution World magazine. So again, if you want the reference, I'm glad to give it to you. But the idea there is that they were required by their Public Utility Commission to survey the customers at large and saying, we're making these investments and of course they made it clear that the benefit was for those that where the investments were being made, and it wasn't not everyone was going to get an upgraded automation system feeding their home or a undergrounded line. However, what they found is that their customers, they stopped polling them. They were doing it for years. They stopped polling because every time they did it, the vast majority of people were willing to pay more over a long period of time. And I think what the sense I'm getting is that there's an opportunity here for these long-term investments. And that's one of the reasons I think it's really great that California is thinking progressively about more of a long-term investment, because the benefit is over a long period of time. And while the upfront costs may be high, if we can spread it over time, and what was key in the WEC Energy Group's study is that people that didn't have the upgrade were willing to pay for others' benefit. Why? And Paul Gauguin was saying he believes it's because when there is an outage all of the crews in one area have to go to another, which then leaves them vulnerable. They don't have the crews that are continually upgrading or maintaining the system. And so they see that if there are fewer outages on the system, that enables the resources to be more evenly spread and a better maintenance and reliability everywhere.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Let's go to our next questioner, Ian Fisher from the Public Advocate's Office.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. Have you got any other examples of where utilities have undergrounded to reduce the risk of wildfire being the cause of the wildfire? So there's a slight difference between talking about, being on the passive side of a wildfire and actually causing the wildfire. In this instance, for example, PG&E has got 26,000 miles of distribution line in high fire threat districts. They're looking to underground 8,100 miles of that overhead line. That still leaves us with the other 16, 17,000 miles to deal with. The main driver here is that it's a cause, not necessarily that we're going to get reliability issues. So I'm just wondering, where is there anyone else that's been studied that you can give me examples?
Yeah, so I don't have an example prepared for you. I do know that the California utilities themselves have a lot of experience and knowledge in this area, so I would defer to them. However, the one area where I would look that I am familiar with, I've seen a number of presentations on. One was at a conference I attended in Versailles, France, was on the wildfires, or they call them the bushfires in Australia. And there they are doing very similar activities and have had a little more experience, a little longer experience.
But they're relying on REFCOL and things like that, not undergrounding.
I'm sorry?
They're relying on REFCOL, they're relying on fast switch and things like that and breakers. A lot of their system isn't relying on undergrounding, it's relying on breakers.
True, but there are some studies about undergrounding
Okay.
and the resilience within wildfires and so forth. So that's all I'm pointing out.
It's not about the resilience. I'm not talking about the rebound effect. I'm talking about the causality. So that's a different thing to me. It's a driver, not how do you recover from it. It's how do you stop the causes.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Excellent point.
Thanks, Ian. I also have a hand raised from Tom Long from the Utility Reform Network.
Good afternoon, Ben. Thanks for your presentation. I represent TURN, which is a consumer advocacy organization. We represent ratepayers. I wanted to, well, first note that I'm a little bit unsure about California ratepayer attitude toward undergrounding. Undergrounding, of course, a lot of people think it sounds nice, but when they hear the price tag and the real price tag for it, they start to question whether it's worth the money. And what we've seen in the advocacy we've done thus far, that many customers are very skeptical about how much it costs and whether it's worth it. But in that regard, one of the themes of your presentation seems to be about life cycle costs, and you're suggesting that there could be significant, although the upfront cost is very high for undergrounding, there could be significant cost savings down the line from savings on maintenance and vegetation management, for example. So my question is that, let me just note one other concern about that. We've seen in the past utility representations that, oh, this is going to save costs. For example, with advanced meters, there were claims that the cost savings down the line would be significant from not having to send folks out into the field to deal with meters. Those cost savings have not really panned out. And in fact, some utilities are finding they have to replace those advanced meters earlier than expected, so the life cycle costs have not worked out there. So my question is, do you have data that shows that these supposed savings that are going to come through down the line have actually played out in utility budgets that they present for these activities before public utilities commissions? Do we have something that documents that this is real and not just a hope?
Yeah, well, I would point you to, there's quite a bit of FERC documentation. I believe it's called the FERC 1 report That is a pretty, it's a large database of all investor-owned utilities, and it shows the raw maintenance cost of underground lines versus overhead lines. So that would be one resource that I'd recommend taking a look at, because that is, and of course the data has been there for many years. So right there, I think would be a good place to say, okay, if our assets were undergrounded, what would the maintenance be? And then of course it's a very well known, the vegetation management is publicly known as well, right? There are plenty of documentation on what that cost is on a per mile of line. And then if you just take it over the life cycle of the assets, those are two really big pieces. Of course, if you don't have vegetation management issues, that's off the table. But what we advocate is we're trying to say, here's where you should look. And if you look at the life cycle analysis and it doesn't make sense, we let the best technology win. So again, we're agnostic as it relates to which solution utilities are using, but we want to advocate that life cycle analysis. And at least those would be two places I would look for data, because we've certainly had a lot of experience that is documented at the federal level, at least on the reliability or the maintenance cost side. And then of course, the vegetation management is another piece that is pretty easy to come by.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And I just want to let everybody know that I apologize we didn't have this presentation from Ben available before the workshop, but I will definitely circulate it to the lists afterwards, so you can all have reference to the slides afterwards. Okay, I don't see any more hands raised right now, and which is great because we're pretty much right on time. Thank you again very much, Ben, and we certainly welcome you to stay with us at the workshop and be available for perhaps questions that may come up later. With that, I believe our next presenter is Eric Wu from the Safety Policy Division, and I will turn it over to Eric. And we need a new slide.
Thank you, Fred. So next slide, please. So again, my name is Eric Wu. I am the interim program manager for the safety management system at a Safety Policy Division. So today I really want to just focus our discussion here is to collect all the information from all of you and to have a better understanding of your thought about all the regulation in the SB 884 and also any other comments that you may have. So today's presentation, I'm just going to go over the current requirement being specified in the SB 884. So we will have some fresh memory about what we're asking, and also you can base on all these criteria to come up with more questions, and we'll be glad to hear and consider your recommendations and suggestions. So next slide, please. So again, that our purpose, the Senate Bill 884 brought up by Senator McGuire in year 2022 and was signed into by the governor on September 29th of 2022. The bill added section 8385.5 to the Public Utility Codes that requires the commission to establish an expedited electric utility distribution infrastructure undergrounding program for the large electrical corporations. And from here, you can see that the last line on the slide is the minimum requirement for utility to join this program. You must have at least 250,000 of customer accounts. And this is just really everything we were talking about today, all the minimum requirement. And of course, that as you have observed from the SB 884, a lot of requirement, it actually leave a lot of room for discussion and interpretation. And also, again, that is the purpose of today's workshop, for us to gather more information from you. Next slide, please. So to participate in this program, the large electric utility must prepare a plan and submit a plan to both to at first to the energy safety, and then after they approve it, we'll submit a plan with the required application to the PUC. So what's the basic requirement for this plan? The first thing that it must be for this plan must include at least 10-year plan of undergrounding of distribution infrastructure. Because this is long-term plan, so we would like to know more about your projection and also a year-to-year target for the next 10 years of this undergrounding plan. And where does these undergrounding need to happen? It must be in the high-fat threat district tier 2 and tier 3 areas, or in the area where it must be rebuilt. And all this must be based on the risk that we identify here, also specified in the SBA 84. You must discuss about the wildfire reduction by looking at their risk, whether it addresses the public safety and how it will maintain the cost efficiency to reduce the burden to the ratepayers. And of course, the most important part also here is to increase the reliability of the electricity, regardless that is during the extreme weathers, especially right now. We have a lot of weather situation going through the entire California, and that become a very important issue for us to address. Next slide, please. And in the content of this undergrounding plan, you must have the timeline for the completion. Then the timeline we are talking about here is not only for the 10-year, but every single year, what's the milestone you have? And with this timeline, you also want to identify the unit cost of your target and the location of all these miles where it will be constructed and finished from year to year. And among all these possible system hardening alternatives or mitigation measures, why do you choose the undergrounding? Is it better, or how does that address the risk issue compared to the others system hardening alternatives? So that is the other information must be presented and included in this undergrounding plan. And at the same time, that when we see the plan that you propose to do undergrounding, what resources do you have? And how do you plan to use these resources? The resource, we are not talking about the dollars. We are also talking about where do you find the workforce, either that's contractors or that's your employee, to implement this undergrounding plan. And further, another key information is that your evaluation of the project cost. How do you evaluate, as Ben was discussing earlier today, there is life cycle cost. How do you evaluate the economic benefit resulting from the undergrounding compared to the long-term maintenance, compared to the other benefit you may have for the undergrounding versus the overhead system hardening alternatives? And then you also want to come up with the cost containment assumptions, how you can avoid all those unnecessary expenses that to relax the burden to the ratepayers. And these are, again, I want to emphasize, these are key elements that they are the minimum requirement. There are maybe a lot more information you can add to this to justify why undergrounding is your top priority and why it benefits California. Next slide, please. So we want to talk about energy safety responsibility. I don't want to speak for energy safety, as we have a counterpart here as well. In general, that based on the SBA 84, that when energy safety received the application and as the first agency receiving it from the utilities, then energy safety will could publish the plan for the public comment. And then with the public comment, then energy safety can evaluate whether the plan address all the concern and provide the necessary information that are approvable by the energy safety. In here, energy safety has 9 months to either approve or deny the plan. But during the 9 months, that energy safety also can require the utility to submit any necessary additional information or make modification to the plan in order to be approved. And then after reviewing the report, then energy safety within 9 months can determine now whether they will be able to approve it or deny it. And then the fourth bullet here is that when the utility receive approval from the energy safety and also start to implement the undergrounding plan, then the utility will have to hire an independent monitor. So that report prepared by independent monitor for the implementation of undergrounding plan must be submitted to energy safety. So therefore, energy safety would also review and publish this independent monitor's report on their website for public comment. And then if there's any delay from the implementing the undergrounding plan, energy safety may be able to refer the case to PUC for any assessment of the penalties or for any assessment of the enforcement actions. Next, please. So the minimum requirement of the plan here for energy safety's approval, what is very important is to reduce the use of the following event that to prevent a wildfire. The first one is PSPS. I think we are all familiar with the triggering of PSPS by the extreme weather, like now in these 2 days in California, and also to avoid the use or reduce the use of enhanced power line safety settings or any possible de-energization events for any that cause the outages to the customers. If the plan must address that why the undergrounding can avoid using all these measures that cause inconvenience to the customers. At the same time, what is very important and the ultimate goal is to substantially reduce the risk of wildfire. Why do you believe that by using undergrounding compared with the other overhead alternatives, such as, again, that covered conductor or use of a sectionalization, that why undergrounding is a better choice for you and to reduce the wildfire risk? Next, please. And at the same time that we come back to our PUC. So after energy safety approved the undergrounding plan, and within 90 days, within, I want to say, 60 days, I apologize, I misspoken, 60 days, that utility would have to submit the approved plan, a copy of the approved plan, together with your application for the cost recovery. And so the plan and the application need to be submitted to the PUC for review and approval within 60 days from the date that energy safety approved the plan. So the utility will do the same as energy safety, will review the application, and if there's any additional information required, we'll send out the notice to the utility. Either you can resubmit it or you can modify the application. And then that is the primary portion of the responsibility of CPUs to evaluate the cost part of it. And then another very key responsibility of PUC is that once the energy safety evaluated report submitted by both the utility for implementation of undergrounding plan and also the independent monitor report, then if energy safety identify any violation issues or any non-compliance issue, they will refer the case to CPUC. So therefore, we'll be evaluating all these documents to determine how we can move forward with the penalty or enforcement case. Next, please. So the minimum requirement here for the application is that what is any substantial improvement in the high risk and the reduction in the cost compared to the other hardening and the risk mitigation measure over the duration of this plan must be included in the application. Also, the cost target and minimum that result into the feasible and attainable cost reductions as compared to the large electric corporation's historical undergrounding cost. And also the next one is the cost efficiency, how the cost target are expected to decline over time due to the cost efficiency and the economics of the scales. And thinking further about the cost efficiency, that we also want to circle back to the life cycle assessment, that how would the cost efficiency compare to the other alternatives as well. And as one of the requirements is for utility to look for additional funding for relaxing the burden of the ratepayers, what's the strategy for further cost reduction in the future? I think that all need to be part of this application submitted to the PUC. Next, please. So the reporting requirement for the utility who are participating in this infrastructure undergrounding program, the utility must file the progress report to Energy Safety and to CPUC every 6 months. This report must document that what you are planning, what you implement, the undergrounding at what location, the progress compared with your original proposal, how much you have implemented, what's the percentage you finish your commitment, and then of course together with the milestones, together with the resources you have put into it as the progress report to both agencies. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, that you must include the ongoing work plan and progress in the annual wildfire mitigation plan filings. That when used, for now, we understand that utility must submit the wildfire mitigation plan on an annual basis or the update on an annual basis. So your plan must be in line with your WMP applications. So we need to be able to verify that, not we, but utility, you need to make sure that the information provided in the WMP are consistent with the information you are providing in the undergrounding plan. And on the top of that, as we mentioned earlier, that once you receive the approval, you will have to hire an independent monitor to make sure that you are making the progress as scheduled. So you will submit the independent evaluator or monitor will have to submit a report by December 1st to Energy Safety. Then again, that report will specify any failure, any program, any places need to be improved, or any item that waiting for the further improvement, all need to be included in this report. And then therefore, the utility need to be able to correct all these deficiencies identified in this report within 180 days. And then again, that to relieve the burden from the ratepayers, utility must also identify any possible available federal, state, or any other non-payers money or funding in order to reduce the costs and burdens, and also become more cost sustainable in the long run. Next, please. So I know we are running over time a little bit. I want to give a very conclusion overview of the SBA 84. From the date that the plan was submitted to the Energy Safety, Energy Safety has the 9 months to approve, including the time that they will be asking the utility to review and or modify or submit additional information to clarify the information in the original plan. And then after 90 days, once the utility received the approval from the Energy Safety, in 60 days, that utility must submit the approved plan and also the application for cost review to PUC. And then within the time before PUC provide our either approval or denial to the application, then we will conduct a public workshop gathering your comment toward this, and to see whether there's any critical information that we must have or that's missing, or whether this application or the undergrounding it has been implemented according to the original undergrounding plan. And then from there, we also will be looking into the 9 months from the data we received the package to determine whether we can approve it or deny it. And from there, that once you receive the approval, once the utility start to implement the undergrounding plan, then you need to submit the report, as we mentioned earlier, every 6 months. And also on top of that, also your independent monitor must submit a annual report by December 1st of each year. And this will be the brief overview of the SBA 84. And I know that you may have a lot of questions about the language. I think we can have all these questions discussed, and I'm not sure we will be able to answer all the questions, but definitely we will be collecting all this information in the following discussion panels. And this will conclude my overview of this requirement.
Thank you, Eric. Yep, we ran a little bit over on the previous segment, so thanks for trying to wrap it up as quickly as you did. We can now move into the next portion of the agenda, which is the panel discussion 1. If there are further questions for Eric, perhaps we can hold those to the end of the day so that we can try to stay on schedule now. Thank you. So this brings us to our first panel discussion on the themes of regulatory and approval process issues. With a set of questions that both CPUC and energy safety staff met about, we conferred and we chose a set of questions that we felt highlighted staff's primary concerns at this point with implementing a program for both of our agencies. And I'll be moderating now this first panel. And our previously identified panelists are Katie Morsoni, Henry Burton, two representatives from PG&E, Megan and Jamie. And we also had a request from Will Abrams to join the panel. After I created the slide, we also had request from Joe Mitchell of Mussey Grade Road Alliance to participate. The structure is we'll try to cover the three main questions in the 45 minutes and allow about 15 minutes at the end for additional questions and comments that can come from our attendees with raised hands, etc. So if we can move to question number one, the next slide, which I don't quite see yet. I do see all the panelists up on the screen. That's good. All righty. Okay, great. So the first question talks about the statute establishing minimum requirements for the plans, but we think there could be some additional requirements that people believe should be considered and included to provide for a successful program definition. I'm just going to choose from among the panelists and ask them to chime in here. Let me start with Katie Morsoni of Turn. If you have some commentary, please, Katie.
Yes, thank you, Fred, and thank you for having Turn here today to discuss these issues. Before I get started, I just wanted to clarify that Turn is providing all of our comments today, and I think I speak for myself and Tom in the spirit of exploration. We haven't come to any final positions on SB 884 and its implementation as an organization, but we're here today to talk about them, to share our initial impressions, pose additional questions, but just wanted to caution that anything I say today or Tom says isn't necessarily our final position on the matter. I think the thing that struck me or strikes me when I look at SB 884 is that in some ways the statute is pretty specific, and by that I mean it uses the word project multiple times to talk about what should be included in the program. It talks about different undergrounding projects, and that word has a pretty specific meaning at the commission and especially within general rate cases. That is and by that, I mean that when the utility is describing what is included in its program, it needs to be specific about locations, lengths of work to be done, mapping exactly where it's going to be, the cost, the risk beneficiency or cost benefit of that project. And I think also that the alternatives need to be looked at on sort of the same level of granularity. So that's sort of one area of clarification that not clarification, but that's kind of my striking. That's how the language strikes me. I think for additional clarification, I would identify what exactly conditional approval means, how exactly the accountability measures are going to be operating. But I think the other questions that you flagged for us will give me more of an opportunity to get into those.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Katie. Let me turn to Henry Burton of our Public Advocate's Office for our next commentary. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Like Katie, we're going to be offering some comments and thoughts, not necessarily our final and most considered positions. We're still working through these issues and trying to understand the implications of this legislation. So on the first question, minimum requirements, I think and are there additional elements that need to be included? I think the bill offers a pretty clear roadmap of the things that need to be included. It talks about identifying projects. It talks about analysis of alternatives. It talks about a method and a prioritization of projects, and also cost targets and a forecast for how those cost targets will decline over time. Those things seem pretty clear. I think the issue that the Commission and Energy Safety need to consider is what level of specificity and granularity is needed under each of those categories. So, for example, on the analysis of alternatives, are we going to be doing analysis at a broad level, like by HFTD tier or by county, or are we going to be doing analysis at the project level? That's something that needs some consideration. And there are other, equivalent questions probably for each of the plan elements. So yes, several of the statutory requirements I think will require further elaboration and clarification. One other thing to raise, I guess, in the category of additional minimum requirements is that the Commission and Energy Safety may need to issue some guidance on timing so that we can ensure that there's coordination and harmonization between the SB 884 plan, the wildfire mitigation plans, and the general rate cases. And I think I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much. Let's go request one of the PG&E representatives, Megan or Jamie. Which one of you would prefer to comment first?
This is Jamie Martin. I'll respond for Megan and I. And I'll echo the appreciation for the opportunity to participate in the workshop today. A few thoughts on these couple of questions that you've laid out. From PG&E's perspective, we think the legislation and the governor's intent was pretty clear, and we see the legislation doing three things. We see it first creating a regulatory review and approval framework that's separate from annual WMPs and 4-year GRC cycles that allows the utilities to commit to and plan out full and long-term infrastructure programs like the undergrounding program that allows utilities to quickly achieve scale and cost savings and other key efficiencies. And just personally speaking, I've led the underground program since its inception or our announcement of 10,000 miles. And before that, I led our procurement function. There's a lot to be said for the benefits of the long-term nature of what the legislation contemplates. I think it also ensures that the underground program is consistent with what was established in Assembly Bill 1054 back in 2019, which puts community safety first and allows OEIS to determine that the work is being done in the highest risk areas, and then allows the CPUC to evaluate financing and cost balancing of the 10-year program. And then the last thing I think it does well is it provides the expedited 18-month regulatory review process so that the long-term program can begin quickly. So I think the legislation is generally sufficient, and I appreciate the comments that have been made, and those are issues worth exploring. But I think the legislation is pretty clear in its requirements. There are probably a couple of things that I'd say PG&E would like to elaborate on. As others have alluded to, there's more information beyond perhaps exactly what's outlined in the legislation that parties or PG&E may want to provide clarity on, and I'd like to see that included for consideration. And then as we think about the evolution of wildfire risk, the legislation is specific that the work occur in high fire threat districts. And so to the extent that there's risk beyond HFTDs, following the process to have the HFTD maps updated to reflect where risk is changing or growing is another area, I think, for Commission and OEIS consideration. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see, I can see Will Abrams on the screen. Joe Mitchell, are you interested in contributing at this point?
Sure, I can contribute. From our standpoint, and Mussy Grade has been deeply involved in the WMP evaluations and also the general rate cases, including PG&E and its underground program. We have a very different perspective than what Jamie stated from PG&E. Because the nature of our understanding of the wildfire problem is changing very, very fast, and we'll talk about this in the next panel, the structure of this program is going to need to be adaptable. It's going to need to be flexible because we're going to learn things about risk and prioritization as we go forward. So we would suggest that there be off-ramps that would allow substitution of goals within the program to allow the utilities to or the regulators to specify that adaptations should be made due to new technologies, new understanding of risk, and so forth. We also think that there should be a cap on rate impacts for low-income customers. I think that's, we'll talk about that a little bit more detail in the next panel, but just examination of the potential impacts from the rate increases that would be necessary to support an undergrounding program of the magnitude that utilities are currently proposing, not even within the scope of this program that we're talking about now. It's pretty it's pretty dire. Next week, the Senate subcommittee on energy, utilities, and communication is going to have a presentation from the CPUC, which is titled "A Focus on Utility Bill Affordability." So on one side, we've got affordability being one component, and a very large capital program on the other that will be working in the opposite direction. So exactly how to protect especially vulnerable ratepayers is very important. So that's all I'll say for that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Looks like we can invite Will Abrams to offer some thoughts here too.
Great, thanks very much. I certainly think that the legislation is clear, but also providing flexibility to OEIS and the Commission to shape some things as well. And so I think it's a good balance in terms of that. I think that one of the things, and I'll sort of echo what Joe was mentioning before, is that I do think that there is nothing within this legislation that says that we need to be keeping this separate and from things like the wildfire mitigation plan and the overall strategy of the utilities. And I would also argue that doing so is really going to be very detrimental. As the utilities know, undergrounding is one tactic, right, within the things that the utilities do to address wildfire risks. So, it really needs to be looked at within the context of those plans. And I think that that's going to be an important part of this. And also, I note that within the legislation, it talks to the regulatory oversight and what needs to occur there. And similarly, I would say that really needs to be integrated into the plan. I think one of the things that I would caution Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety on is not sort of building and approving these undergrounding plans and then figuring out how you're going to provide regulatory oversight. I would suggest building in regulatory oversight into how the plan takes shape so that you can make sure that whatever plan comes up, whatever plans are eventually approved, has sufficient oversight built within that. In terms of clarification of the legislation, as I said, I think that it is really clear where it needs to be and providing flexibility. But there are two areas I think that we could use some clarity around, either within the commission proceeding or through other means. One is, there's a strong emphasis on applying non-ratepayer funds to address these issues. And I think, there's a catch-all that says other. It says, federal, state, and other resources. And I think we really need to focus on that. Again, build it into the plan, is how we are going to be, how the utilities are going to be actively seeking those funds. There's opportunities here for public-private partnerships. There's opportunities here to work with telecommunications providers to have supplement the costs with joint trenching and things that they can get into that additional conduit that's within that trench. There's lots of ways to really supplement this so that the end bill to ratepayers is really reduced. So I think that's an area where we could really focus for additional specificity. And as I mentioned, the other area I think that is important to focus on is this compliance piece. So it talks about that in general terms, and I think the important part of the proceeding to really flesh that out and be more specific about where and how it integrates within the plan, so that we can get the direction headed where we need it to go. So those are just my initial thoughts on how we're proceeding. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Plan is to move on to our second question. And then if there are remaining discussion points that we want to revisit or other attendees want to comment, we'll do that at the end of this panel session. So, okay, question 2 is now being displayed. I'll read it out, although it's a little bit fuzzy on my screen. Should the expedited undergrounding program process align with the wildfire mitigation plan and or general rate case processes? So that's part A. If so, what specific aspects should be aligned and how should the alignment be effectuated? Well, just for variety's sake, why don't I go back to Katie to start us off on the second question?
Yeah, I think that it's important to have everything aligned with one another. I think that we need to be efficient in our resources. There's nothing in the legislation that suggests that each should be kept separate and in its own little bucket. In fact, the language in there about the general rate case decision in section E3, that the commission shall consider not revisiting cost or mileage completion targets approved or pending approval in the electrical corporation's general rate case, I think really demonstrates that these different proceedings are supposed to be coordinated with one another. And I think that this is a place where, in this question, I was really struck by the fact that both OEIS and the CPUC have very different missions and goals and things that they're looking at, and that how their role in this proceeding is to build on those strengths. With OEIS, it's in the wildfire mitigation plan and looking at safety, how safety is being met. Then on the other side, the general rate case, the CPUC is a rate making expert, and the CPUC is looking at how this program is going to impact the other goals that the commission and the state has, like reliable, affordable, and also our emissions reductions goals. And so I think it's incredibly important for these 3 different proceedings to talk to one another and be coordinated with one another, so that we don't reach a place where we're potentially putting one of these other goals of the CPUC in question, because no matter what, the goals are the requirements of 454 for the PUC are going to be in place.
Great, thank you, Katie. Let's see, continuing in my rotation, I think I called on Henry Burton after Katie.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is a really important question. And in some ways, I think answering this question about alignment between the three relevant closely related proceedings is the fundamental implementation question for SB 884, because everything else in some fashion is going to flow from this question. So from the public advocate's perspective, there's a number of concerns and potential issues that we think need to be kept front of mind here. One is regulatory efficiency, and having an efficient, clear process for the two state agencies involved, Energy Safety and the Commission, and also for all the stakeholders who are going to be involved, who are going to be doing a lot of analysis and work on reviewing and analyzing these plans. So we need a process that is efficient and uses everybody's time well. We also need to bear in mind the affordability concerns that other folks on this panel have mentioned. It's potentially a lot of money at stake and a potentially substantial impact on customer bills. So to that end, there may need to be an update process to revise or modify the project selection to make sure that the utility is continuing to be focused on the right projects over the entire 10-year horizon. Other concerns that we want to raise here would be double counting of projects or costs between different proceedings, that we could have a utility proposing X number of miles in its WMP and Y number of miles in its rate case, and it's unclear how those two numbers overlap, and there can be double counting. There can be different cost forecasts, different cost recovery mechanisms, and at the end of the day, we need to make sure that all the projects that are approved are just and reasonable, that they are authorized and paid for once, and that they're completed correctly. So there needs to be clear authorization about how much money and which projects are going to be completed. And then there needs to be accountability to ensure that those projects are completed on time and as promised, and that the work is done correctly. To the second part of this, which specific aspects should be aligned and how should it be effectuated? The Public Advocate's Office, we think most likely we're going to need the Commission and Energy Safety are going to need to determine that one proceeding is the controlling proceeding, and that the decision or document adopted in that proceeding is the one that rules the day, and all the other two, right, of this triangle of proceedings, the other two will need to conform to that controlling document. It's worth noting that as far as costs are concerned, the general rate case has some advantages because it does give the utility the ability to have forward-looking cost authorization to recover costs on a forward-looking basis. For the wildfire mitigation plans, I think the most likely or the most obvious solution to me at this point in time is that Energy Safety would issue guidance that once an 884 plan is approved, any subsequent WMPs during that 10-year timeframe must conform to the adopted 884 plan. So that guidance would avoid any conflicts or confusion between 884 plans and WMPs. You just say, once your 884 plan is adopted, all your subsequent WMPs for the next 10 years must conform to it. And I think that's all I need to say for the moment.
Thank you. I'll turn over to PG&E, Jamie or Megan on this topic.
Sure, I'll take the lead again. So a few general thoughts on just as we think about the three proceedings that we're describing, 884, the GRCs and the WMP. Generally, we think it's important to align the underground plan with both the GRC and the WMP, but recognize that utilities are on different schedules and timelines with respect to their GRCs, and sometimes even with the approval timing of their WMPs. And so we don't think that there should be a generic alignment approach, but utilities should propose specific alignment in their CPUC applications based on the statuses and schedules for those specific utilities. As already noted, our pending GRC request at PG&E includes the first portion of our undergrounding program, and it considers cost recovery through 2026. And so, and the legislation, as also was articulated, points back to GRC proceedings and says they don't necessarily need to be relitigated or re-arbitrated. And I think, from our perspective, there's a lot of merit in that. I also think that, given what 884 outlines in terms of processes and parameters, that eventually posted for us a 2026 GRC, there wouldn't need to be cost recovery through the GRC because 884 defines a cost recovery process. I couldn't agree more that we have to make sure, and that's the commission's role, to make sure there isn't double counting. There shouldn't be double counting, that there shouldn't be double cost recovery, and we'd look to the commission to set those parameters. As also has been articulated, and we agree with, undergrounding is one component of wildfire mitigation. And so alignment between the WMPs and any 884 plans is important and necessary to have fulsome looks at wildfire risk reduction in totality, because as we've described in our WMPs, undergrounding isn't the only tool in the toolkit, though it is an important tool. And then something that we haven't discussed yet, but I think is something for the commission to consider, is the inclusion of undergrounding and wildfire as part of our wildfire risk analysis in the RAMP proceedings, and accounting for new approaches to the risk assessment framework in RAMP. I think I'll stop there as well, because I think the next section gets at some of the other components.
More about risk in the following panel. Exactly. Thank you.
If I could cut in for a moment, Jamie, you said that SB 884 defines a cost recovery process. Where is that, and what do you understand that to be? Because as I see it, that is perhaps the largest unanswered question in this bill.
Sure. I guess I think about it as saying, when I said that, I meant it points to the GRC as a potential cost recovery process if there's an open GRC proceeding. And I think it leaves open the possibility for the commission to set a cost recovery process for SB 884 plans. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm taking my own notes. Give me a second. Let's see, who haven't we heard from? Joe says, pick me. Okay, Joe Mitchell.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to make some more tangible proposals here, because this is a 10-year framework. Unless it's a list of segments and circuits with years tied to them, that's an extremely inflexible framework, and I don't think that's going to end up working or end up being the way that it will be implemented in the long run. We will be having multiple wildfire mitigation plan cycles. We'll be having multiple GRC cycles within this framework. So I would suggest taking advantage of these for implementing the 10-year plans. The WMPs would provide an opportunity for the utilities to outline the specific circuits, details, tranches that they will be working on and planning within the next 1 to 3 year timeframes. Where changes need to be proposed to the plan, to the overall framework, though both for short and long term, those could also be proposed in the WMP. Now, the reason the WMP is appropriate is that it gets full review by both energy safety and the commission, unlike the GRCs, which are, the commission's process. Also, as far as revalidating the assumptions that are used in the prioritization and risk estimations that are done, those can be specified within the WMP framework. Either the utilities could initiate that, or regulators could request that different aspects of risk be looked at in the WMP, and how would this potentially affect the 10-year plan. And then, of course, the GRC is a 4-year cycle, and that will provide the rate recovery. So I think all of these things can work within this overarching long-term plan that is being that's been legislated, and be used to enhance them. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Let's see, do we have time for Will to chime in on this topic? Will Abrams?
Sure. Yep. Thank you. So I think a lot of great points were made on this question. I just want to stress that I think that the integration with the wildfire mitigation plan is really, really critical. I think we can have a great undergrounding strategy, but if it doesn't fit with the overall efforts around wildfire mitigation, and we have a cohesive strategy, then the operations that follow that likely also aren't going to be as effective. So really, in my view, although this may be developed separately, it needs to have a place within the wildfire mitigation plan. It needs to have a place within that document so that we understand how this fits in with the other pieces and parts of a utility wildfire mitigation plan. I also think it's really important as we look at this, that it's not a point in time calculation of risk reduction, given that this is something that's going to be more permanent in many ways than an overhead line. We need to be thinking about how we are looking at this over time. So the legislation talks about balancing risk reduction, cost, reliability, other benefits, and all of those things are not just point in time evaluations, but how this is going to affect in the long term. As we think about new technologies coming around and how we're going to need to be adaptable to a changing climate, we need to think about how our grid's going to adapt as well. And so I think really understanding those implications are important. As an example, I think identifying which lines are underground isn't necessarily that we're putting that particular line underground, right? It might be a completely different route, right? So it's not like a one-to-one substitution of, line A goes underground. It's a different routing, and we need to understand that and understand the implications of that. We have to understand the implications of if 5-10 years from now we're looking to create more microgrids. How would that be accommodated now that these lines are underground, right? We need to understand this in the context of how cities are developing, right? So we're underground in the town of Paradise right now, and the lines leading into that. What are the implications if that town grows? What are the implications of, again, making sure that the safety infrastructure is within the microgrid? Lots of different things to consider, but this is not a point in time evaluation of which reduces more risk. Is it covered conductor or is it undergrounding? And that's the determinative factor. We need to have this be looked at in a more complex way. And so I think the commission should be cognizant of that, and utilities should make sure that their analysis reflects that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think we've touched on everyone. pipe up if I've left somebody out at this point. So let's move to question number 3. Oh, this is the open-ended catch-all question. Just an opportunity for folks to offer any other comments on the general subject about establishing the program around process, regulatory requirements and such. I'll just see a raised hand from anybody that would like to jump in. Okay, Katie.
Yeah, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about accountability and to follow up on something that Joe said earlier, and that there needs to be off-ramps. The parts of the program that are supposed to be very clearly outlined in the application are timelines, unit cost, a comparison of alternatives. And I think even though those, how that's going to be done is talked in the next panel, I think we need to be clear on if the projects that are completed are not meeting thresholds or meeting the expectations that they were intended to. We need to be able to pivot and not pursue, greater, deeper investment in something if it's not having the outcomes that were promised in advance. So, potentially identifying and adopting cost caps that decline over time, or targets for different elements of the program that is ultimately adopted by OEIS and the Commission, and being pretty clear on both not only the penalties for missing potential targets, but also how we're removing and changing the plans to based on the actual outcomes that we've seen.
Thanks, Katie. Any other folks?
Sure, I'll pipe up. So I'll just reiterate again, I think that the Commission and Energy Safety are going to need to establish a clear regulatory process that's efficient, and that's going to probably require determining that one of these 3 proceedings, the WMP, the 884 proceeding, and the GRC, is the controlling proceeding, and that everything else must conform with that. And that also will entail giving guidance to the utilities that want to participate about when they should file each of those documents so that they can harmonize. So that's one point that I think is crucial here. A second point that should be under consideration is whether and how the 884 plans can be updated at some midterm point. And Katie just talked about off-ramps. Joe's mentioned something similar. So we know that wildfire science is evolving. We know that utility wildfire risk models are changing pretty regularly, pretty rapidly. And obviously PG&E has, well, not everybody might be as familiar, but PG&E has a distribution wildfire risk model, and they've issued a new version of it, developed a new version of it every year. Version 3 is substantially different from version 2 last year. Version 2 was substantially different from version 1. And so those 3 sequential wildfire risk models would give you very different ideas about where you want to focus your effort and do the undergrounding work. We also know that PG&E is in the process of developing version 4, and will continue over the next few years to reiterate or to iterate and revise its wildfire risk model. So what I'm getting at is that this is potentially a 10-year plan. We don't want to lock in projects that turn out to be a mistake. We also don't want to lock out projects that later turn out to be necessary. We need to have a mechanism for incorporating the latest risk analysis and the latest wildfire science, and that's going to probably require some kind of update mechanism to change the project prioritization and change the list of projects that are on tap for any given year. So that's something that should be under consideration. And then the last point I'll mention here briefly is the application of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. And I am by no means the CEQA expert. Other folks in Cal Advocates are more familiar with CEQA and have worked with that, but I just want to flag the issue for everybody's consideration that our initial analysis is that an SB 84 plan would have foreseeable impacts on the environment, on cultural resources, and therefore would probably be subject to CEQA. And that's something that everybody here should be thinking about. If an 884 plan is subject to CEQA because it has foreseeable impacts on the environment, then either Energy Safety or the Commission is going to be the lead agency for CEQA review. And that's going to be a challenge with the timelines set out in this bill. So it's going to be difficult for the lead agency to meet the requirements of CEQA while also meeting the 9-month or 18-month in total review timeline for an 884 plan. And so that might lead to needing some kind of pre-application process to begin the CEQA review. I'll leave it there. Other folks can probably provide more informed and in-depth thoughts about CEQA.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Was there, it looks like Joe is nodding. Did you want to chime in or do we? Okay, Joe, please.
Yeah, okay, I'll go then. Yeah, I totally agree with what Henry and Katie brought up. Another issue that I think we might want to consider, just to quote Ben Lance's slides, he said, one of them said something to the effect of, utility executives in Wall Street want opportunities to invest billions with a guaranteed rate of return and eliminate O&M. And I think this is a gorilla in the room issue. Utilities are heavily incentivized to do capital projects, heavily incentivized to have a maximal undergrounding program. Is there a mechanism by which we can incentivize utilities to reduce wildfire risk, reduce power shutoff risk in the most cost-efficient way possible, rather than just brute force scrimmaging between utilities and the regulators and advocates that happens all the time. I just wanted to bring that up as one possibility we might want to think about in the framework of this legislation, because the legislation is obviously there to reduce wildfire risk and power shutoff. That's its intent, and we want to make sure that happens. Also, I think what Katie mentioned about cost caps, I think exactly how that gets implemented with regard to especially impacts on low-income ratepayers, I think that needs to be laid out in the framework for this program, and as soon as possible, so that the utilities get clear guidance. Because there's an element of fairness here. You don't want to get through these two processes and then just have the utilities told no because we don't like it. There should be if we're going to make it affordable, and there is intent in the legislation to make it affordable and to find other rate mechanisms, other cost recovery mechanisms, what should be acceptable and what should not. I think that's something that needs to be developed earlier on rather than later, so that we can have an efficient discussion of these issues and not end up at a dead end 18 months down the line after these plans have been put in.
I had a couple things, if I'm on the.
Sure, yeah, go ahead, thanks.
All right, thank you. On the question that was posed about points of clarification, the first one is timeline and schedule. So PG&E is prepared to file a plan in 2023. The guidelines consistent or in line with what SB 884 outlines, and the timing of those guidelines would be helpful to inform the filing. So that's one area of clarification. that I put on the table, another area of clarification that I put on the table, and we've kind of talked about it in the first two questions, but you know, the bill itself outlines a procedural regulatory process and a timing, and we've gone over and discussed how to think about, is the legislation sufficient and what it puts on the table with regard to what should be in the filing. Answering the question around rulemaking is another important thing that I think we'd look to OEIS and the CPUC to answer. Our position is that 884 provides what's needed and rulemaking isn't necessary. I think rulemaking leads to a much longer timeline than the 18-month process that's outlined in 884. 884 is pretty clear in its intent of creating an expedited utility distribution infrastructure undergrounding program. So a procedural schedule is another, like I said, important point of clarification. Those are the couple of things from us.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Let's see, we haven't heard from Will yet, and then we'll go with Katie. Go, Will.
Thanks. Yeah, I also sort of noted that that focus on having an expedited plan, and I just want to make sure that we're being really careful about that. I think certainly as a wildfire survivor, I have a lot of urgency around this as well. And I think that that is reflected in this legislation in terms of doing this expeditiously. But, you know, we just have got to really make sure that the other aspects of this are not short-circuited in order to get this done quickly. Again, this is a more permanent fix than it is an overhead line. So we really need to make sure that we're doing it carefully, and also it was stressed in the legislation as well, collaboratively. So there was a focus on public participation. I would say that that would mandate that we move forward with public participation hearings around this to really make sure that we're gauging the public around these different strategies. Another thing that I wanted to state again is it's really important to build in, you know, how we're paying for this, and also how we're providing oversight around this into the plan itself. Because if we leave it till after the fact, it's not going to get us to where we want to go. I would say that the utilities have a lot to offer that around that, particularly around the costs. I think, you know, I was excited to see PG&E looking at things like green bonds and things like that to cover these types of efforts. So really getting a readout on that and how those types of programs can be brought to bear to reduce costs for the ratepayer, I think is going to be really important, and really needs to be baked in to the proceedings so that we understand that as we're moving forward with the development of these plans.
Okay, thank you, Will. And Katie has her hand up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question for PG&E. Earlier you noted that the GRC would take us through, I think, 2026, but then you also just said that you'd be ready to launch a plan in 2023. Would that just be reflecting what would come out of the GRC? Or how, I guess, how do you combine those? How do you make them work together?
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you how we think about it. So I'd think of the similar information as what is in the current GRC filing in the filing that we'd be in the 884 filing that we'd be prepared to make. So similar mileage trajectory and cost forecasts reflected kind of through the reply brief in December. I think, you know, we've thought about the 10-year clock starting upon approval of the filing. So for example, you file in 23, you follow the 18-month schedule, the plan is approved in 25, the 10 years is 25 through 34. And I'm just offering that just to put it on the table. The legislation, I was flipping back through it, it does point to existing cost recovery mechanisms. For example, the wildfire balancing account as something that the CPUC can consider in its process for cost recovery. Those things together are how we think about stitching together the GRC, as to not necessarily relitigate it, but leverage it to put the whole 10-year plan together. Because again, for us, this is really about something beyond the 4-year GRC cycle. It's about the 10 years that's contemplated in 884.
Thank you. I've got a hand up from Henry.
Great, thanks. I wanted to mention there's a number of vaguenesses or ambiguities in the bill that I think would benefit from more specificity in the implementation, and that probably points to a commission rulemaking to resolve some of these issues. Many of those have been discussed already, things like update mechanisms, the application of CEQA, cost caps. But another one that I don't think has been raised here specifically very much is the obligation that utilities have to seek non-ratepayer revenue sources. So the bill says that utilities should, seek alternative funding sources before they recover costs from ratepayers. That seems like a good idea, but there's a lot left to answer in terms of what sources are available and how proactively or aggressively does the utility need to seek those, and what will the utility do to demonstrate that it has made a thorough effort to find all of the available non-ratepayer sources of revenue. So I think that's an issue that bears some further consideration, and a commission rulemaking to flesh out the requirements of the bill would be the best way to resolve many of the ambiguities in the legislation.
Okay, thank you guys. And we're right at the 3:15 designated time. I think we managed to cover the ground pretty well here in our 1 hour. I hope you'll all enjoy a short break, about 15 minutes, and we'll come back at 3:30 with our panel 2. See you then. Welcome back, everybody. We'll allow another minute or so for people to come on back in. Well, I think we should move on to the next section, and people can join in as they're able. This would be moving to panel session 2, and I'm going to turn over affairs to Julie Alvis from Energy Safety.
Great, thanks, Fred, and welcome back, everyone. I'd just like to welcome the panel 2 folks to join us. We have Tom Long from TURN, Ian Frazier from the Public Advocate's Office, Jamie Martin and Paul McGregor from PG&E, and Joe Mitchell from Mussey Grade Road Alliance. So I'm just going to kick right into question 1, which has a bit of a setup. And so Ian, if you could just be prepared to maybe start us out after I read the question with PG&E, either Jamie or Paul, if you want to follow on, and then we'll just go through there. But question 1 says the statute requires electrical corporations to compare undergrounding to other system hardening alternatives, emphasizing both the risk reduction and the cost effectiveness of undergrounding for the projected useful life of the undergrounding project versus the alternatives. So what this question is asking is, what analytical approach and decision-making framework should be employed by the electrical corporations in their plans to justify the undergrounding proposals, and what level of detail should be provided in the plans and why? So Ian, if you don't mind kicking us off.
Thanks, Julie. And it's Ian Fisher, by the way, not Fraser.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. So just on that, let's start with the basics. I think there's a fairly good framework within the wildfire mitigation plan to start with. Let's start there. They already have developed risk models and risk assessments at a very detailed level to actually be able to assess where and when they should be doing this sort of mitigation. So I don't see there's any need to depart from what's happening in WMPs, just in a risk assessment. As to, not sure what that was. As to the level of detail, well, I think SB 884 is fairly clear. It requires project level information. And so I would expect to see project level detail in any sort of framework for assessment of cost benefit, assessment of risk reduction, assessment of cost benefit, any sort of assessment for the life cycle of the plans, and any sort of comparison between different mitigation methods. So that's kind of where I want to leave that. The only other thing I want to say there is, whilst we're thinking about the benefits of risk reduction, of wildfire risk reduction and ignition risk reduction, there are other risks involved here. And so if we're going from overhead to underground, you're going from overhead wildfire risk to underground potential seismic, flood, landslide risks. It's maybe that we need to start building in additional risk factors to any kind of methodology that we're developing. Then, of course, there's the other sorts of risk, there's financial risk, and the potential for actually developing these undergrounding projects in the wrong places. And so then there's potential stranded asset risks. So I want to see a whole risk set assessed on a project by project basis. That's where I would like to be. That also kind of ties back into things like the Commission's RAMP proceedings, where they really are looking across the whole corporate risk profile. And so it would help build up from a very granular level, which we have in the risk modeling that Paul and Paul's teams do, all the way up to the RAMP, the kind of corporate level modeling that's done in RAMP. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that is actually where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Great, and moving on to PG&E. Paul, or?
I think Jamie and I both will have a couple of things to say on this one, so I don't mind going first and kind of responding to some of Ian's thoughts. I do agree with Ian that we have a good framework in place through the regulatory mechanisms of the wildfire mitigation plan, and quite frankly, from a funding perspective, through the GRC. I don't think we need an additional mechanism to do so. We can certainly leverage what we have. Neither are perfect, but it's a good basis that we can have a look at the various issues and exploring what's going on. As Ian said, there are a number of things to consider when we look at undergrounding. And from my perspective, as the Director of Wildfire Risk Management, the key thing I'm interested in is wildfire, and that relates to safety, both for the constituents and the communities in the area. But as one of our presenters today from PDI2 said, and this is very near and dear to PG&E's heart, taking workers off the road in performing O&M type services, such as inspections, such as vegetation management, such as repairs, things like that, and taking people off the road with more and more people on the road in California is a key reduction in motor vehicle risk and motor vehicle safety related risks. So that was very near and dear to our hearts. at PG&E, we have witnessed fatalities recently, with our workers being on the road. So I took that one close to heart. With regards to the models, are models perfect? No, but models do provide a good insight into where we're going. And I think we've done a good job so far with the help of the regulatory framework and the push from some of the interveners into developing what the metrics are in those particular models, whether they be wildfire risk, whether they be PSPS de-energization risk, or future risks that we're exploring, the impacts of smoke emissions, smoke inhalation, etc. So the model structure that we've got, we're quite comfortable with sharing how our models are constructed. We're quite comfortable sharing what we think the project list would be for that undergrounding in various tranches. And I did want to respond to something that was mentioned in the earlier panel discussion about some of the movement in PG&E's risk models. Happy to take this as a separate discussion when we come to towards the end of today's session. But when we talk about the high fire threat districts and the overhead line miles in PG&E's HFTD, it's all risky. It's just a question of how risky. And we see that first, that top 70, 80% of the risk is really contained in 20% of the miles. It's that Pareto rule. And that's really what we're going after with this wildfire risk and with this undergrounding plan to mitigate wildfire risk. The key thing for me is that undergrounding is necessary for that top end of the curve, because even were we to mitigate it with another program that doesn't take the asset out of contact with object or from equipment failure, you're still leaving residual risk there. And the problem with the steepness of the circuits and the overhead mileage that in our service territory is that even if we were to mitigate it with less than undergrounding in that top part of the curve, we're going to come back to it in 2, 3, 4 years' time as some of the highest risk circuit segments again. Undergrounding takes that out of contention and puts these assets in the ground straight away.
Tom, let's move to you. Do you have anything to add?
I do. Thank you. I'm really glad you asked this question. I think it's highlighting one of the most important parts of the statute to compare undergrounding with the alternatives to undergrounding and require the utility on a project basis and require the utility to demonstrate that undergrounding is superior to those alternatives. We believe that undergrounding projects should not be approved if there are more cost-effective alternatives. To do that assessment, we would recommend that the utilities use the risk-spend efficiency analysis as it has been updated and revised by the Commission, the CPUC, over time, including using the cost-benefit approach that was recently adopted in Decision 22-12-027. That methodology is a holistic methodology that takes into account the full range of risk reduction benefits from the programs that are being compared or from the projects that are being compared, including the reliability benefits from PSPS reduction. And it compares those benefits to the cost, which is how we are able to compare the cost effectiveness of competing approaches to wildfire mitigation. We think this valuable information will provide an opportunity for the agencies to set an RSC or cost benefit floor that projects should meet in order to be able to go ahead. Consistent with the statute's focus on project level detail, the utilities should provide these cost effectiveness measures on a project by project basis. And so in that regard, I would have a little bit of I'm not sure I'm in accord with what Jamie said earlier about the GRC level submission being sufficient. I don't recall there being, and I'm quoting the statute here, any identification of the undergrounding projects that will be constructed. I didn't see any identification of specific projects in the GRC application. So I think this statute is calling for more detail than what would be typically provided in a GRC. Just a couple other points on the level of detail. and maybe getting into the weeds a little bit here, but the utilities, to support their demonstration of superior cost effectiveness, should provide complete Excel work papers showing how they calculated the benefit cost measures. And in order to facilitate a sensitivity analysis, those work papers should allow the agencies and the parties to run alternative inputs, or otherwise the utility should be required to provide results of alternative inputs on a very short turnaround. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Great. And then before moving on to Joe, PG&E, did you want to respond back, or should we just move forward and loop back?
Can you hear me? Yeah, it sounds like you can. I think it's up to you if you want us to go back and forth, but maybe in the interest of time, we proceed.
Sure. Okay. Let's, Joe, do you want to go ahead and?
Yeah, I'll just, I'd like to echo with what Tom and Ian said. I agree strongly that and also Paul, we have a framework in place. Just to add on to Tom's point, these cost benefit analyses that are done need to be complete. They need to include potential technology solutions, not just on their own, but in conjunction with, say, covered conductor and so forth. Such technology solutions such as REFCL or SDG&E's falling conductor program. Also included the cost of PSPS events, as well as the wildfire mitigation value of PSPS, need to be both included. And also, I think that some of the other issues such as smoke and so forth, we'll talk about that in more detail in the future section when we talk about the viability of a 10-year plan. But I think we can go forward with the WMP framework. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And before moving on to the next question then, were there any additional comments that would like to be shared after hearing from each other? Okay, we will move on. Oh, yes, Ian.
Sorry, I just had to quickly review my notes. So yeah, just to reiterate, what I would like to see and the level of detail I would like to see is really related to understanding exactly where the overhead line is being removed, more so than where the undergrounding is going, simply because the wildfire risk is a function of the overhead, not of the underground. And so the ability to track and trace that is going to be essential as far as I'm concerned in understanding exactly the benefit of the undergrounding. And then we can actually look at the variance between the variance in location between the undergrounding and the overhead, and all sorts of sort of conspecific things like that. So yeah, I just think I can get very specific with what this looks like. And then on top of that, got to remember that we're talking about removing 8,100 miles of overhead here and burying 10,000 miles of line, 10,000 miles of line. So just be aware of there is a difference between the overhead and the underground, and it's fairly substantial. And then the cost of that is fairly substantial. So we just need to take that into account. Thanks.
Please feel free to respond, Tom.
Just real quickly to follow on to Ian's point, which I think is a very good one about knowing where the underground, the overhead line is going to be removed. But I would also say it's really important to know the path that the undergrounded project is going to take as well, because it's often not going to be the same as the overhead line, right? And so, and that's going to create issues for environmental review, the CEQA issues that Cal Advocates mentioned earlier. And so it could be a very different and circuitous path that needs to be taken in order to deal with obstacles like rocks and water and other things. So I think it's important to know both.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to a question 2. And so IT can help advance the slide there. I'm hoping, Tom, you'll be able to start us off with this question around accountability. So legislation provides for an annual report by an independent monitor and a 6-month progress report from the Electrical Corporation. How can these reports be maximized for accountability? Are there additional accountability tools and procedures to consider to ensure that projects are completed on time, on budget, and are actually reducing risk?
Okay, thanks. I will start. On the subject of accountability requirements, those requirements we would recommend be built into the agency decisions. And the tools that are prescribed should follow from the issues that SB 884 says are important. So one of them is the intent to require the requirement that the projects be prioritized and that the use of undergrounding be superior to other alternatives. As I just mentioned in response to the last question, there should be, we think there should be a benefit cost or some sort of cost effectiveness measure floor for projects to meet in order to meet those requirements, that prioritization and superiority requirement. And that this should be addressed in the utility progress reports. They should provide updated cost effectiveness measures for each project to show compliance with the floor that the agencies have established in their decisions. And in addition, in those projects to sort of deal with the changing nature of these risk assessments, for planned projects for a specified future time period, the utility should be updating the cost effectiveness analysis to help determine if the projects going forward still meet the floor requirements and is still superior to other alternatives based on cost effectiveness measures. Another accountability tool that we'd like to see prescribed in the agency decisions are ones to ensure or to follow through on the statute's intent to ensure cost control and containment. So as Katie mentioned earlier in the first panel, we're thinking there should be a declining cost cap, a cap on weighted average costs for each 6-month time period, and the reports should be demonstrating the utility's progress in compliance with the cap. Just a couple other things to maximize the effectiveness of these reports. The reports should show how the utilities are doing compared to cost targets, cost effectiveness targets, and report and explain any deviations where they're not doing as well as the targets. And in that, we'd really like to see a requirement that they provide all material reasons for deviations, even if they're unflattering to the utility. And in addition, we would recommend that these reports be executed under oath by an officer of the utility. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Jamie or Paul, would you like to follow on?
All right. I think you can hear me. Great. Audio issue. I have a few thoughts on accountability. Certainly, annual miles completed against established commitments and progress against those in the 6-month reports. The cost per mile for projects that are completed, and the total risk mitigated for the work that has been done. I think that, we think about the 6-month progress report would be a progress update, and at the end of the year, an annual report would indicate whether we met our annual targets, which would include annual cost targets and annual mileage targets that have been set and approved by the agencies. The legislation also indicates that an independent monitor be hired to review and assess the utility's compliance with its plan, and that they would submit a report with each office in December of each year over the course of the plan. The legislation outlines independent monitors' responsibilities and what they would report on, It gives the utilities the opportunity to respond and correct anything in the report. And then, OEIS and the CPUC would have their traditional oversight authorities with respect to the plan and the application. And so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Joe, can I move this question on to you next?
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to mention that there are several timescales associated with the legislation, and the monitoring needs to be applied at each of those timescales. There's the 10-year plan itself. Because of the rapid changes in fire science, engineering, understanding of risk, this should provide some overall goals and guideposts that the utility and the independent monitor should track on a longer term basis. Second, there's the 4-year timeline of the GRC and the funding and the cost recovery, and also the accountability report for that. This should also be analyzed with respect to implementation of the 10-year plan. There's also the yearly or annual WMP update. That should be integrated in some way with the annual independent auditor report, either informing the auditor report where the auditor would use information in the WMP, or the auditor's report becoming an input to the WMP. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Great. And Ian, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. I'll just pick up on two things I heard there and just want to kind of riff off of those. Going back to Paul's comment about the split in the risk being sort of an 80-20, 20% of the actual circuits having 80% of the risk. That's a point in time. That's as of 2021, 2022, whenever. When we come to actually observe this and you start to reduce the risk on the worst circuits and the riskiest circuits, then your risk profile is going to change just as a matter of you reducing the risk. And so we need to develop and ensure that we're developing some sort of baseline assessment against which we're assessing and a method to do that, to demonstrate, if you want to demonstrate you're reducing your risk, is it risk as of 2022? Is that what we need to do? In which case we need to take a snapshot of your system as of now and work, do a back comparison to demonstrate you've got down to, you've removed that 80% of risk that you were observing before you started the plan. So there's a baselining issue here that we need to address, and we have to have a good conversation about and how we go about that, because that may also be a shifting baseline given the climate's changing, technologies are changing, the risk is going to be changing as well. So I think we need to build an approach into there. Paul, if you want to respond to that, that's great, and then I'll get into my second point.
Oh, so, okay, you have multiple points. Just to respond to that, I support what you're saying, that we need to come up with a mechanism to have a baseline to measure against. What we've attempted to do at PG&E, and we've put this into our WMP, I think it's table 8123, excuse me, memorizing the numbers. And in that particular table, what we attempt to do is to say, here are the project miles in relation to this top 20% of our risk, that 80-20 rule. And that's a carryover from prior WMPs where we've communicated that same thing. It's effectively locking it to the risk model that it was measured against. And we're saying, okay, we did 80-odd% of our work in this particular tranche of the riskiest segments to demonstrate that we're focusing on that. So I do agree that some kind of mechanism, I think that PG&E, I know PG&E is doing it. I don't know if the other utilities are doing something similar on their risk reduction activities on their circuits, but I'd certainly welcome multiple heads getting together to come up with an aligned and agreed upon way of doing so.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And then I have a second point I just want to make with regard to the independent monitor. And this is just observations from how the independent monitor has worked in the WMPs. The lag I would like to avoid the lag issue that we have with the independent monitor in the WMPs, especially because if anything has to be passed back to the commission for citation because the PG&E or because the utility is failing to undertake to meet the targets set in their plan, and the commission has to cite them, then sometimes it can be very stale by the time the information gets back to the commission. So, you're seeing issues with a 2-year lag at the moment in the WMPs between when the work was meant to have been done and when it's being reported effectively to the commission. That there needs to be some way of shortening that. That's my other observation.
Great, thank you. Unless there's any additional comments to the second question, we can move on to the third question for our panel. And seeing none, IT could help forward on to the next question. This is about the length of the plans. The undergrounding plans are 10-year plans. How should the evolving understanding of risk and ever-changing methods of calculating risk be accounted for in the plans? Should flexibility be built into the plans to account for uncertainty and long-term risk forecasting? And would a mechanism to alter an approved plan be needed? Why and how? And Jamie, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, or Paul from PG&E on this question. Can't hear you.
Okay, I apologize.
Oh, there you go.
Yep, Paul and I will tag team this. We kind of think of this as a 3-part question, so I'll take sub-bullet 1 and then turn it over to Paul. So we've talked about this a little bit on this panel and the other panel, but with regard to the first part, how should the evolving understanding of risk and changing methods in calculating risk be accounted for in the plans? We all acknowledge, I think, that risk is changing. The risk itself changes, analytics around risk changes, and they improve. So I think the approved plan should be viewed as a framework for the undergrounding program, that the specific projects and work plan within the framework could change as risk model inputs change over time and additional information is obtained. I think the changes in the actual work plan could be reported or submitted in the 6-month reporting that we've discussed. And I think that's in line with the intent of SB 884 with regard to progress updates. It asks for updates to work plans based on the latest risk model. I'm going to turn it over to Paul for the second part of the question.
Oh dear, Paul, I think we're having trouble hearing you.
No, I'm having trouble pressing the mute button. We're very used to a Teams interface. It's a little bit different. Okay, first of all, thank you, Jamie, for teeing that up. And I'll rattle quickly since I lost us 30 seconds. I want to respond to the part about flexibility, and the need for that flexibility is absolutely yes. Things are going to change. You can hear it from me that when we have a localized level and we see changes in our circuit geometry, pieces of circuit are added, pieces are removed, updates to GIS, new equipment put in place, so things change. But we also have changes from the perspective that, as our opening speaker said, we have people moving into the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. So we have new circuitry being built into higher risk areas that we might not have simulated before. And that comes back to when we then run the simulations on these areas, we may see new patches of ground that have not previously been inhabited or previously had asset put upon them, that we then assess those, and these might jump up higher in prioritization orders. So I think it's important that we stay flexible to the basics. In addition, there's going to be changes to our models. If I think back to the last couple of wildfire mitigation plans, a number of the initiatives that PG&E and the other utilities have put forward have been tweaks and changes to a risk model to accommodate requests and guidance from the interveners, from the regulators, etc. That's also changing how we rank and stack and score our circuit segments. And then any changes to the overall framework through risk OIR or anything similar is going to introduce yet another set of changes. These are, GIS localized activities and modeling constructs, but then we also have to look at the actual grounds that we're operating in as well. And I think it's worthwhile pointing out that a lot of this is framed upon the original high fire threat district maps that were developed by a number of convening parties and the regulator. But those maps are dated. They're not wrong, they're just dated. And things change across time. For me, it's close and personal. The HFTD maps were born out of the Fire Map 2 project, and the data that was being used for that is probably 2010, 2012 framework by the time it made its way into legislation 2018. Joseph's giving me a nod, so I think he agrees with kind of where I'm going with this. We are seeing changes in the vegetation. We've seen multiple years of droughts, particularly in the latter teen years. And we will possibly see more going forward. For goodness sake, I live in San Diego County and we've got a blizzard warning for the first time in history. So we're seeing changes. These changes are going to be manifest in the fuels that we see on the ground. And as a result, there is a need to update those maps as we go forward. Because we do see, and that's the wind howling at my door, this is unusual in San Diego. We have changes in the maps, we have changes in the climate, and that has an impact on our infrastructure, especially as we have people moving into the WUI, as we see people working remotely, people not being constrained to an office. So there are lots of changes going on, and we need to capture that when we have our framework. Framework can be relatively firm with principles, but the actual mechanics of it need to be flexible to accommodate the changes at both macro and micro level.
Okay, Joe, can I move this question on to you for your take?
Yes, please. I'm happy to agree with most of what Paul said there. I totally agree that the utility risk calculation methodologies have undergone significant changes and improvement over the last few years. Process is not slowing down. We're still litigating over some of these in the WMPs and in the GRCs. To the extent of our utilities correctly incorporating the extreme winds that are associated with most of the catastrophic loss fires. How is the landscape going to change when wildfire smoke, which has huge health impacts, is incorporated into the utility risk models in a scientifically sound way? And that still needs some development. The utility ability to model megafires that are responsible for the majority of loss of life and property. And then also, I think another axis is the technology axis. We are learning more and more about different techniques to address risk, such as rare earth, REFCL.
Rapid earth fault.
Rapid earth. Yeah, it's like, oh dear. Okay. SDG&E has its own high impedance fault trip, falling conductor tripping. Those are important to take in. And as Ben Lance mentioned today, undergrounding itself is undergoing technology improvements as well. So it may be that down the line, you have a more compelling case for undergrounding in certain specific areas because you've improved the technology on that. So then one aspect I think needs to be integrated somehow into this process is the incorporation of the risk that extremely high rates has on low income ratepayers. As part of the last WMPs, I had looked at the curve of life expectancy versus income. And if you apply that to a large population and you incorporate rate increases that are conceivable under these programs, you start to see significant impacts on public health, lost years of life due to impoverishment. And so what we don't want to have happen is that people like me, like Will Abrams, who live in the wildland urban interface or move into the wildland urban interface, as Ben Land said, oh yeah, we're happy to pay more for our better protection. Well, yes, I am. I'm doing okay. But we don't want to have happen, and what I think the commission wants to ensure doesn't happen, is that we shift risk from people in the wildland urban interface onto low income and vulnerable populations in California. And that's why I think these pieces on affordability that have been put into the law, even though it's not quite clear how that's going to be enforced, we need to come up with a very clear mechanism for enforcement on that, so that we ensure that we're not hurting the people that we want to protect. So regarding the updating the mechanisms to have these targets and these new targets included, the wildfire mitigation plans, I think, are an appropriate place to make updates to the specifics of how each leg of this plan is going to be updated. Utilities and regulators can propose changes at that time. That's where we can have the reprioritization of circuits and segments. Also, this is an undergrounding plan. So the question I think needs to be, that I'd like to see answered is, okay, what if we find out that we can, instead of undergrounding these particular segments, we can do it much better, say, by covered conductor and a specific technology in combination with that covered conductor that does it much more cost effectively. Should that then be, can we have a mechanism for substituting that in to the undergrounding plan and have that be okay, and have the utility somehow, incentivized to do that? So that's I think that's all of the comments I have for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Let's move on to Ian, please.
So not a huge amount to add on this one that hasn't already been said, to be honest. There really does need to be the flexibility to change the list of projects and what's being affected each time, what's being implemented throughout the project process. I'd be a bit more cautious about the frequency of updates because I would want any changes to be thoroughly understood and the cost benefit of any changes to be thoroughly vetted, thoroughly vetted. So, a 6-monthly update, a 12-monthly update may be, to my mind, a little too frequent because that's simply too frequent to be vetted. The utility itself, you work on a 3.5 year life cycle from identification through to construction. A 3 to 4 year life cycle for actually understanding and changes makes a lot more sense to me. And it also gives the opportunity to do the proper cost benefit analysis and to look at these alternative methods and to look at alternative mitigation methods. So that's the only thing I would talk about here, is really the cycle of review and the timeliness of that. Getting to kind of just touch on Joe's point, we've got to be aware of the risks of ratepayer shock and transfer of costs across all ratepayers from wildland urban interface to suburban to urban ratepayers. This is shared across everybody. And so we have to be very aware of what those implications are. And that needs to be, the commission at least has to pay attention to that in how we fund this. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Tom, do you have anything to add?
I do. I'm trying to, I think we can all agree that there's and we've all spoken to flexibility being an important consideration, but I'm also trying to square that with the statute, which governs here. And the statute requires project-specific information and various showings on a project basis that we've talked about. So what I envision coming out of that is a commission or is agency decisions that identify the projects that get the green light based on the work that's been done in those proceedings, and based on those approved projects, providing a what we would recommend there be a cap on the scope and the cost of undergrounding over the 10-year period. Now, that's to us feels like what the statute is saying is supposed to happen. But then the question is, what happens when things change? And what everyone's talked about. Well, one thing is that in updates, periodic updates, the utilities should be reporting how their projects, the metrics for their projects are comparing with what they presented to the agencies initially. And there are going to be some that fall out, that no longer meet what we would think would be the right way for the commission to do this, which is to have cost ceilings and cost effectiveness floor measures that have to be met. And if they're not meeting those anymore, they should drop out. And that should be a streamlined process for the agency or for the utility to report that, you know, these projects are no longer cutting the mustard and they should drop out. What gets more complicated is if the utility wants to substitute or add projects that have not previously been presented to the agencies. That's not such an easy streamlined process because they need to be vetted under the criteria set forth in the statute, and the agencies need to allow meaningful public input. I don't think this is impossible. I think we can be leveraging the GRC process for this, but I do think we have to be thoughtful about following the requirements of the statute, which doesn't allow the need for flexibility to, it doesn't mean for that's the agency should be foregoing the requirement for specific project level showings that show that the projects are worthwhile and should go forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, and I'm curious if anybody would like to chime in on that question of, you know, how to balance flexibility with specificity. If there's anything more to say around that, or if there's any other questions or comments that we can circle back to with any of these three questions we've explored.
Hey, this is Jamie. I have some thoughts on how we might, or how agencies might consider the balance. I think my read of SB 884 and the reporting mechanism that's outlined, the 6-month update, I think there's a way to provide a level of specificity of where the work will be done based on risk models at the time, acknowledging that the intent of the legislation is to do the work where the risk exists most, leveraging the reporting process to say, here's the work that the initial filing where we believe the work will occur based on risk models, file updates, leverage those updates to articulate those changes. Because I think the legislation is clear what the primary objectives are. Do the work in the highest risk areas, do so at a cost profile that has been agreed upon, do so at mileage targets that have been agreed upon. And so I think there's potentially something in the reporting mechanism that lends itself to the flexibility while meeting the intent of the legislation.
Great. Well, that makes, we've successfully made it through the three questions that staff had prepared for panel 2. There are any other comments? I'm welcome to share them now, where I will pass things back to Fred. And also, I just want to thank you for your time today. And Ian, I do see your hand.
Yeah, I noticed there's a comment from Will Abraham's date at time 3:49, so that would be for this panel, but in the chat. So I don't know whether Will you want to ask it or whether you want me to ask it.
Great. Let's see. I don't know. So do I have?
I'm happy to clarify if that.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I just the original question that was posed to the panel was around this question of useful life, and just wanted to understand if the panel had some perspective on how that would be reported. Obviously there's an increased useful life for putting some of the lines underground, but there might be components or parts where there's different useful life to be considered. And so just wanted to understand if that was going to be an interim process where they're reporting out on the remaining useful life. And I also just wanted to ask the panel how the utilities might be able to respond to sort of more immediate requests for undergrounding. One of the clear areas where we can reduce costs, in my mind, is to overlay some of these plans with the public plans for road maintenance and make sure that we're aligned with that. So if next year Sonoma County decides that we're going to be undergrounding this line, I would certainly want to make sure that we can support the utilities on sort of getting up to speed quickly to save costs and leverage that work. So I don't know if that means in the initial plan filings that some of those things are put forward, but I just want to make sure that while we're being careful about where we're undergrounding, that we're also giving the utilities the opportunity to be opportunistic when those types of opportunities come up. Thanks.
I'd be happy. I think Paul and I are the utilities on the line, so I'm happy to respond. So I'll take your second question first, if that's all right, about coordination on other infrastructure projects. And so there's a few ways that we've thought about that, and I'll say right now, I don't think we've dialed it in yet. We haven't. There's work we're undergrounding now, and there's likely to be work happening post our undergrounding projects. But I'll say that our intent in having multi-year plans and visibility into what the projects are and where the projects are is to engage at the county level, at the city level, with those plans to allow for coordination on impacts to the community and the customers. So road work that's planned, aligning the timing of our projects for construction with the timing of that road work, and vice versa, potentially adjusting the timing of the road work to align with the timing of underground construction. So that's aligned with our community engagement strategy and our local engagement strategy. Because I concur, I think there's opportunity there. So that's how I think about your second question, and feel free to pop back on if I can clarify anything. Your first question related to useful life and how to incorporate remaining useful life into the understanding of the cost benefit of less frequent but potentially more costly repairs for underground lines. I think the way I'll respond to that is I need to think about that. We need to think about how we incorporate that into our cost benefit analysis. I think it's a very interesting consideration. And what happens when you repair a line underground, and how does that extend the useful life of that particular asset relative to its original life, potentially providing longer term benefit even with a higher repair cost should there be a need for a repair. So I'll have to take that back and think with the team about how we could incorporate that. I'm going to pause and either let my other panelists comment or allow a follow-up from.
And thanks, Jamie. That was great and really helpful. And I know, we can't expect that all these questions are going to be answered at this point. And with that, just really also thinking about how does the plan change when there's a wildfire, right? And so I think PG&E specifically has learned a lot that, putting the lines right back after a fire, has evolved over time in terms of that philosophy. And so, again, if we have a plan where there's prioritization of lines, but, a wildfire occurs, whether or not it is utility caused, but that presents an opportunity to do some lower cost, more efficient undergrounding. I just want to make sure that we have built in within the plans that flexibility to adapt to those that change.
We're aligned on that. I think the legislation itself allows what we consider those fire rebuilds to be part of the plan. And then as part of our WMP, we've said that, fires may occur. And if those fires do occur, that fire rebuild work could be incorporated because the risk is materialized. Whatever the cause might be, the risk is materialized. And if it's logical to put those lines underground in a rebuild, it's the right thing to do. And it is often lower cost. You're totally right.
Julie, this is Fred. Before we end, I wanted to mention that we did receive one question in the Q&A box that perhaps I could just read it out and I'll present that. We had a person ask, how can a community group provide inputs to the PG&E undergrounding risk model? And I'm thinking maybe this is something for energy safety to tackle.
I actually don't feel comfortable moving forward at this time with an answer to that. I'm hoping to just use this time to hear from our panelists and then to circle back with my team to make sure that I'm representing the agency appropriately as the acting in this capacity right now. So sorry to say I am going to punt that one. But does the panelist have anything that they want to chime in on in regards to that question that Fred just shared? And Joe, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think that because we're talking about having the same risk model in the WMPs that we have is going to be re-leveraged for SB 884. There is a public comment process for the wildfire mitigation plans. The utility risk models are fairly well described in the wildfire mitigation plans. And so, the public is encouraged to put in comments on the WMPs regarding the utility risk models. And that's how our community has added to the discussion on the wildfire mitigation plan risk models.
Thanks, Joe.
Yep. And if I can just add a little bit, and this is me speaking, I'm not speaking for PG, I represent PG&E, but this is my opinion on this particular matter, that there are mechanisms. We receive as PG&E a number of customer inquiries. Hey, are you undergrounding my community, my area? Most of the questions are in a positive frame. Hey, when are you guys doing this? So because they're excited about it. And we are explaining to some of these customers that the undergrounding plan is at the 8,000 existing overhead miles that becomes a 10,000 mile plan. It's not the entire HFTD. So this is a discussion that we have to have, and we do explain other mitigations that we've got, for example, our EPSS program, etc., to protect them from the event of contact from foreign object and equipment failure in these high fire threat districts. but there are other mechanisms available. I do recall a community group, I believe they called themselves the League of Cities, and it was a number of cities around the coast of California, certain places like Laguna Beach, Pacific Palisades, a number of other ones, probably Carmel, places like that, where the communities did get together and looked at programs and how to, more from a beautification purpose for undergrounding, as opposed to a wildfire risk reduction. But there was the push to consider wildfire risk reduction as well. I know there was a lot of discussion between those community groups and our Rule 20 teams, a team I am not part of, but that is another avenue that communities can investigate and have a look at those as options.
Excellent. Well, I think we are at time for panel 2. And Fred, can I pass this back over to you and your co-host responsibilities? And again, thank you to the panelists today, providing a lot of good information to think about as we move forward with this.
Yep, please do. I'll take it from here. Also want to thank the panelists. So this is basically just the wrap up for the meeting. I have a slide here that we want to give people the opportunity, if they have more things they want to say or they would like to provide written informal comments, we're asking that you send those to us by March 10th, or in other words, 2 weeks from today, because we are trying to go forward with a timely process to start getting this program going. And we've created the mailbox SB 884 at cpuc.ca.gov, a dedicated email mailbox to collect information regarding SB 884. So that's displayed on the slide you should be all seeing here now. And I think, as Forrest mentioned at the top of the hour, the next steps are that our two agencies really have to decide how we are going to move forward. We do not specifically intend that there will be a rulemaking, but that is a possibility. There are other decision-making avenues available to our agencies to establish new programs. So that is really undecided at this point, but the future may involve additional workshops or technical working groups to hammer out some of the more detailed level things about the questions that we've asked today. So that's my wrap up. I will also be sending out Ben Lance's undergrounding trends presentation shortly to the same service lists that were invited to the workshop, so you should have that available. My division, the Safety Policy Division, will be standing up a new web page on the CPUC website dedicated to SB 884 activity, and we will be posting all the workshop materials from today, as well as a link to a video of the workshop that I expect will be available by next Monday or Tuesday. So that is what I have to say about the next steps. We have a little bit more time. Like to entertain any final questions, but if not, then I want to wish everybody a great rest of your day and weekend, and I really look forward to a very productive program that can come out of all of our work today. Thank you.